I'm 24 years old, and I live in Wyoming now, but I spent the first 23 years of my life in West Virginia, deep in the Appalachian Mountains where the fog settles thick between the valleys and the nearest town is a 40-minute drive down winding roads that wash out every spring. I left because what happened there shattered my family in a way that made it unbearable to remain anywhere near them. More than that, it shattered something inside me that I'm still trying to piece back together. To give you some context about how I grew up, you need to understand that my parents were always emotionally absent, not in the dramatic way you see in movies, where they're screaming and thrown dishes and slammed doors. It was quieter than that, and somehow worse. They were simply not there, even when they were standing right in front of me. Life in those mountains isn't easy for anyone. The winters are brutal, the work is endless, and the isolation does something to people over time. Some folks develop a kind of hardened exterior, building walls out of constant labor to keep their minds busy, to avoid thinking too deeply about the hand they've been dealt. That's exactly who my parents were. My father worked at a lumber mill 40 miles away, leaving before dawn and returning after dark, his hands perpetually wrapped in bandages from the machinery. My mother cleaned houses for the few wealthy families who'd built vacation homes in the area, coming back each evening with her shoulders hunched and her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. Dinner was usually something reheated, eaten in silence except for the scrape of forks against plates and the hum of the refrigerator in the corner. Because of this, I grew up in a house with two people who, in many ways, were complete strangers to me. I couldn't tell you my mother's favorite color or what my father thought about when he stared out the window on Sunday mornings. I don't know if they loved each other, or if they simply existed in parallel tracks that happened to share the same space. What I do know is that they looked through me more often than they looked at me. I've always been a socially isolated person, with no real friends and barely any extended family that mattered. The kids at school could smell the loneliness on me the way animals smell fear. I was the one who ate lunch in the bathroom stall, who failed gym class because I refused to participate in team sports, who never got invited to birthday parties or sleepovers. My mom and dad were completely indifferent to this. When I came home with a black eye in 5th grade, my mother simply handed me a bag of frozen peas without asking what happened. When my report card showed I was failing social studies, my father grunted and turned back to the television. That kind of isolation really messed with me in ways I'm still discovering. I could go days, sometimes entire weeks, without saying a single word to anyone. I'd move through the house like a ghost, and my parents would move around me the same way. That lack of connection made me desperate for anything that resembled human warmth, which meant I turned a blind eye to things happening right in front of me. I ignored warning signs that should have been blazing red because I was starving for attention, even if it was small and conditional and came from the wrong source. My grandparents lived about 10 minutes away through the woods, in a larger house that had been in the family for 3 generations. They weren't ideal either. My grandmother was a thin, severe woman who spoke in clipped sentences and seemed perpetually disappointed by everything and everyone around her. My grandfather was a harsh man, especially when he drank, which was most evenings. I can still hear the sound of his voice rising through the floorboards when I'd visit, that particular edge of anger that comes from someone who's been grinding their teeth on bitterness for decades. So, as I said, I turned to the youngest of their children, my father's brother, my uncle. His name was Lawrence, though everyone called him Larry, and he had always been different from the rest of the family. By the time I was old enough to pay attention, he was already 42, but no one really knew what he did for a living. He never left for work in the morning like my father did. He never talked about bosses or coworkers or deadlines. He spent most of his time indoors, glued to his computer screen in that converted porch space adjacent to my grandparents' home, and in a family like ours, where men were supposed to work with their hands and their backs, that made him something of an oddball. That fascinated me. Here was someone who didn't fit the mold, who seemed to exist outside the rigid structure that made everyone else so miserable. I looked up to him, idolized him even, and willingly ignored all the red flags that I can now see were flapping violently in the wind from the very beginning. His living space wasn't inside the main house. It was a large converted porch that wrapped around the eastern side of my grandparents' property. Someone, probably my grandfather decades earlier, had enclosed it with walls and proper insulation, added a bathroom and a small kitchenette, and turned it into a surprisingly spacious apartment. It had its own entrance through the garden, which meant Larry could come and go without anyone tracking his movements. The inside was dimly lit, always, with heavy curtains drawn across the windows even in the middle of the day. He said it was because the light hurt his eyes from staring at screens for so long. I believed him. I started spending more and more time there when I was around 9 or 10. At first, it was just weekend afternoons, sitting on his couch while he worked at his desk, the blue glow of his monitors washing over his face. He'd let me watch movies on his television, things my parents would never have allowed, horror films and action movies with excessive violence. He'd order pizza and let me eat as much as I wanted. He'd ask me about school, about what I liked and didn't like, and he'd actually listen to my answers. For a kid who'd spent years being invisible, that attention was intoxicating. The sleepovers started when I was 11. My parents didn't care, or maybe they were relieved to have me out of the house. I'd pack a small bag on Friday afternoon and walk through the woods to Larry's place, where I'd spend the weekend playing video games and eating junk food and feeling, for the first time in my life, like someone actually wanted me around. That's when the strange things started. The first incident I remember clearly happened on a Saturday night in late autumn. I must have been around 11 years old, maybe just turned 12. The temperature had dropped significantly that week, and I remember Larry had a space heater running in the corner that made the whole room smell like burning dust. I'd fallen asleep on the couch around 10, exhausted from a day spent hiking through the woods behind his property, exploring abandoned hunting stands and following deer trails until my legs ached. I woke up sometime after midnight, that jarring kind of waking where you're not sure what pulled you out of sleep but your heart is already racing. The television was off, and the only light came from under Larry's bedroom door at the far end of the living space. That wasn't unusual. He often worked late into the night, and I'd grown accustomed to the sound of his keyboard clicking and his mouse scrolling as I drifted off. But this was different. There were sounds coming from his room that I couldn't quite identify. At first, I thought maybe he was watching a movie with the volume low, but the audio quality was wrong. It was muffled, like it was coming through speakers that weren't quite working properly. And beneath that, there was something else, something that made my stomach clench even before I understood what I was hearing. It sounded like crying, muffled, desperate crying. I lay there in the darkness, my sleeping bag pulled up to my chin, trying to convince myself I was imagining it or that it was just part of whatever he was watching. Larry didn't have friends. I'd never seen him with a girlfriend or even talking to anyone on the phone except for my grandparents and occasionally my father. The idea that there might be someone else in the house, someone who sounded that distressed, didn't make any sense. But the sound continued. After what felt like hours but was probably only 15 or 20 minutes, I couldn't stand it anymore. I needed to know what I was hearing. Needed to confirm it was just a movie or a show or something innocent that my tired brain was misinterpreting. I slipped out of my sleeping bag as quietly as possible, my bare feet silent on the cold wooden floor. The house was old enough that certain boards creaked, and I knew where most of them were from my countless visits. I avoided them now, moving in a careful path toward Larry's door. My hands were shaking, though I couldn't have told you why. Some animal part of my brain was screaming at me to get back in my sleeping bag and pull it over my head and pretend I'd never woken up at all. I should have listened to that instinct. When I reached his door, I pressed my ear against the wood. The sounds were clearer now. It was definitely a woman, and she was definitely terrified. Her breathing was rapid and shallow between the muffled cries, the kind of hyperventilating panic that makes your chest hurt just listening to it. Underneath that, I could hear Larry's voice, low and steady, almost soothing if you didn't listen to the words. I couldn't make out what he was saying, but the tone was wrong. It was the voice of someone trying to calm a frightened animal, clinical and detached. The door wasn't fully closed. There was a gap of maybe 2 inches where the latch hadn't caught properly, and through that gap, I could see a sliver of his room illuminated by the harsh white light of his computer monitors. My throat was so tight I could barely breathe, but I leaned closer, positioning myself so I could see through the opening. Larry was sitting at his desk, his back partially to me, but I could see his hands moving on the keyboard and the reflection of his monitors in the window behind him. On the screen, there was a video playing. The quality was grainy, like it had been filmed on an old camera or in poor lighting, but I could see everything clearly enough to understand what I was looking at. A woman was tied to a chair in what looked like a basement or cellar. The walls behind her were concrete blocks, water-stained and crumbling in places. Her wrists were bound behind her, and there was duct tape across her mouth, silver and gleaming in the harsh light of whatever was filming her. But it was her eyes that I still see sometimes when I close my own. They were wild with terror, darting around the room as if looking for an escape that didn't exist. Tears streamed down her face, and her whole body was trembling violently, making the chair legs scrape against the concrete floor with a sound that made my teeth ache. I watched, frozen in horror, as Larry edited the video. He was cutting sections, adjusting the audio, doing something with the timeline that I didn't understand, and he was completely calm. His posture was relaxed, his movements efficient and practiced, like he was editing a family vacation video or a school project. I don't know how long I stood there. Time became meaningless, compressed into that single moment of understanding that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. My child's brain couldn't process what I was seeing, couldn't reconcile it with the uncle who bought me pizza and let me stay up late and was the only person in my life who seemed to care whether I existed. Then I made a mistake. I shifted my weight, and the floorboard beneath my left foot let out a long, loud creak that echoed through the quiet house like a gunshot. Everything stopped. Larry's hands froze on the keyboard. The video paused, and then, slowly, he turned in his chair to look directly at the door, directly at me, though I couldn't see his face from my angle. "Why are you out of bed?" His voice was calm, eerily calm, but there was something underneath it that made every hair on my body stand straight up. I couldn't answer. My throat had closed completely, and my legs felt like they'd been filled with concrete. I just stood there, my eyes still pressed to the gap in the door, unable to move or speak or do anything except stare. He stood up then, and I finally broke from my paralysis. I ran back to the couch, dove into my sleeping bag, and squeezed my eyes shut so tightly that colored spots exploded across my vision. My heart was hammering so hard I thought it might break through my ribs, and I could hear my own blood rushing in my ears like a river. Footsteps approached. Slow, deliberate footsteps that stopped right beside the couch. I could feel him standing over me, could feel the heat of his body and the weight of his stare. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. I kept my eyes clamped shut and tried to breathe normally, tried to pretend I was asleep, though I'm sure he could see me trembling. Finally, he spoke. "If you're going to snoop around in the middle of the night, you're not welcome here anymore." Those words hit me harder than any physical blow could have. The thought of losing this place, losing him, losing the only connection I had to anything resembling affection, was more terrifying than what I'd just seen on that screen. My eyes snapped open, and I looked up at him. His face was cast in shadows, backlit by the dim glow from his room, but I could see his expression. He wasn't angry exactly. He looked more concerned, like he was trying to decide what to do about a problem that had just presented itself. "What was that?" I managed to whisper, my voice cracking. "What was I looking at?" He was quiet for a long moment, and I could practically see him calculating, choosing his words carefully. When he finally spoke, his voice had returned to that gentle, reassuring tone I was used to. "That was a police documentary I'm helping edit. The woman you saw, she's being investigated for serious crimes. They had to restrain her because she's dangerous. Understand? She hurt people, bad people, and the police needed to question her." The word restrain was foreign to me. I'd never heard it before, didn't know what it meant, but I nodded anyway because I desperately wanted to believe him. I wanted everything to be okay, wanted to return to the comfortable ignorance I'd had just an hour earlier. "You can't tell anyone what you saw," he continued, crouching down so his face was level with mine. "This is official police business, and if word gets out that I'm working on it, it could compromise their investigation. Do you understand? People could get hurt if you talk about this." I nodded again, more vigorously this time. "I won't tell anyone, I promise." "Good." He reached out and ruffled my hair, that same affectionate gesture he'd done 100 times before. "Get some sleep. And next time, if you hear something strange, just stay in bed. Curiosity killed the cat, you know." He stood up and walked back to his room, closing the door firmly behind him this time. I heard the lock click, a sound I'd never heard before from that door. I lay there in the darkness, my mind racing but my body exhausted, until eventually I fell into a fitful sleep filled with images of concrete walls and silver duct tape and eyes wide with terror. The incident faded into the background over the following days and weeks, helped along by Larry's behavior. He showered me with attention and gifts in a way he never had before. New video games appeared on his shelf for me to play. He took me to the movies in town, just the two of us, and bought me popcorn and candy. He listened even more attentively when I talked, asking questions and actually remembering my answers. I was happier than I'd ever been. My parents had never given me anything, not even on my birthday, which they often forgot entirely. Here was someone who not only remembered but who seemed to care, who wanted to make me happy. The video from that night became something abstract in my mind, a bad dream I'd had, easily explained away by Larry's story about police documentaries and dangerous criminals. I wanted to believe him. God, I wanted to believe him so badly. And so I did. because the alternative was unthinkable. Years passed. I grew from a child into a teenager, though not a particularly successful one. School remained a nightmare of social isolation and academic apathy. I failed more classes than I passed, not because I wasn't capable, but because I couldn't bring myself to care about anything that happened in that building. The other students had long since given up trying to include me in anything, which suited me fine. I had Larry, and that was enough. Or at least, I told myself it was enough. By the time I was 15, nearly 16, I'd spent hundreds of nights at Larry's place. I knew every inch of that converted porch, every creaking board and loose door handle and water stain on the ceiling. I'd long since stopped thinking about that night I'd seen the video. It had been years, and nothing else strange had happened in all that time. I'd convinced myself it really had been what he said it was, just me misunderstanding something I was too young to comprehend properly. The incident that shattered that careful illusion happened in late winter. It was February, I think, when the temperature drops below freezing and stays there for weeks, when the ice gets so thick on the trees that branches snap under the weight and crash through the forest like gunshots. I'd had a particularly brutal day at school. Nothing specific, just the accumulation of 1,000 small humiliations. Being shoved in the hallway, having my lunch tray knocked out of my hands, hearing laughter follow me wherever I went. By the time I got home that afternoon, I felt like I was suffocating, like the walls of my house were pressing in on all sides. My parents were in the living room, watching television in their usual silence. I stood in the doorway for a full minute, waiting for one of them to acknowledge my presence, to ask how my day was, to notice the fresh bruise blooming on my cheekbone where someone's elbow had accidentally caught me. Neither of them looked up. I needed to talk to someone, anyone. The desperation was physical, a clawing in my chest that made it hard to breathe. Around 10 that night, long after my parents had gone to bed, I slipped out my bedroom window and started walking through the woods toward Larry's place. It was brutally cold, the kind of cold that burns your lungs with every breath, but I barely noticed. I was too focused on getting there, on finding that one person who might listen, who might make me feel like I mattered. The walk usually took about 10 minutes, following a well-worn path through the trees that I could navigate with my eyes closed. I was about 8 minutes in when I collided with someone coming from the opposite direction. The impact wasn't hard, but it startled us both. I stumbled back, an apology already forming on my lips, when I got a good look at who I'd run into. It was a boy, probably 17 or 18, dressed in jeans and a thin hoodie that was completely inadequate for the weather. But it wasn't his clothes that made me freeze. It was the blood. There was a gash across his forehead, just above his right eyebrow, and blood was streaming down the side of his face, dark and thick in the moonlight. His hands were scraped raw, and there was dirt ground into his clothes like he'd been crawling through the underbrush. But worse than any of that was his expression. I'd never seen anyone look that terrified. His eyes were wild, darting between me and the trees behind him, and he was breathing in short, sharp gasps that turned to white clouds in the frozen air. "Please," he said, grabbing my arm with trembling hands. "Please, you have to help me. There's someone. He's chasing me. He's going to kill me. Please." I should have helped him. I should have run with him back to my house, should have called the police, should have done anything except what I actually did. But I couldn't think. My brain had simply shut down, overwhelmed by the wrongness of the situation, by the blood and the fear and the desperate grip on my arm. "Please," he said again, and there were tears mixing with the blood on his face now. "I don't know where I am. I need to get to a road. I need to find help." I pointed, just pointed toward where I knew the main road was, about a 20-minute walk through the woods, though you couldn't see it from where we stood. "That way," I managed to say, my voice sounding strange and distant to my own ears. "Follow the trees down until you hit the road." He stared at me for a moment, and I could see him trying to decide if I was trustworthy, if my directions were real or a trap. Then he released my arm and ran, crashing through the underbrush in the direction I'd indicated, leaving spots of blood on the snow behind him. I stood there, rooted to that spot, for a long time after he'd disappeared. My thoughts were moving too slowly, like they were trying to wade through deep water. I knew I should be doing something, should be helping somehow, but I couldn't figure out what that something was. The area where we lived was completely isolated. My grandparents' house, Larry's converted porch, my parents' place. We were all clustered in the same few acres of land that had been in the family for generations. There was nothing else around us for miles except trees and hills and the occasional abandoned structure from when the area had been more populated decades ago. The closest neighbor lived far to the south, at least a 30-minute walk, and even then, it was just one old man who kept to himself. Even though I'd pointed the boy toward the road, I knew no one was likely to come by for hours, maybe not until morning. It was a rural route that saw maybe a dozen cars a day, mostly locals who knew the area. The chances of him finding help quickly were almost zero. I should have felt guilty about that, should have felt terrible for not doing more. But all I felt was numb and confused and increasingly cold as the adrenaline started to fade and the temperature reasserted itself. Eventually, I continued walking toward Larry's place. I don't know why. Maybe it was habit, or maybe some part of me was still hoping for that comfort I'd been seeking when I left my house. I knocked on his door several times with no answer. The lights were off inside, and his car was gone from its usual spot in the gravel driveway. I went around to the garden and retrieved the spare key from the hollow of a tree where he'd shown me he kept it years ago. The house was dark and silent when I entered. Larry wasn't there. I figured he might have gone to the tavern in town, the one place he sometimes went to drink alone at the bar, or maybe the 24-hour gas station where he sometimes bought cigarettes late at night. So I turned on a lamp, curled up on the couch with a blanket, and waited. At some point, I fell asleep, because the next thing I knew, it was morning light coming through the curtains, and Larry was standing over me, saying my name. His voice was sharp, angry in a way I'd rarely heard from him. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "How did you get in?" I sat up quickly, disoriented and still half asleep. "I used the spare key. I'm sorry. I should have asked first. I just needed." "You can't just come here whenever you want," he snapped. "This is my space, you understand? My private space." "I'm sorry," I said again, scrambling to gather my things. My backpack was on the floor, and I started shoving the blanket into it with shaking hands. That's when I noticed what he was wearing. Or rather, what was on what he was wearing. His jeans were covered in dirt, dried mud caked from the knees down. His jacket had similar stains, and there were scratches on his hands like he'd been pushing through thorny bushes. But what made my stomach drop were the two reddish-brown streaks on his face, one across his cheek and another near his temple, like he'd wiped his face with dirty hands and hadn't realized what he'd transferred there. "Are you okay?" I asked, the words coming out before I could stop them. "What happened to you?" His expression changed instantly. The anger drained away, replaced by something I couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe, or fear. He sat down on the couch next to me, suddenly gentle again. "I'm fine. Just went for a walk last night and tripped over a root in the dark. Took a pretty good fall." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You know how clumsy I can be." That's when I remembered the boy. The memory came rushing back in vivid detail, and before I could think better of it, I told Larry everything. About leaving my house, about the collision in the woods, about the blood and the terror and how the boy had begged for help, said someone was chasing him. I watched Larry's face as I spoke, and I saw something flicker across it when I mentioned the boy, something that looked like fear, or maybe recognition. His jaw tightened, and his hands clenched into fists on his knees before he consciously relaxed them. "When did this happen?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Last night, around 10, maybe 10:30. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at nothing in particular. Then he stood up and walked to the kitchen sink, turning on the water and splashing his face repeatedly, scrubbing at those reddish-brown streaks until they disappeared down the drain. I watched the water run pink for just a moment before it cleared. "That's concerning," he finally said, his back still to me. "Did you see which way he went?" I told him how to get to the road. "Good, that was smart." He turned around, drying his face with a dish towel. "You did the right thing. I'm sure he's fine now, probably made it to town and got help." "You said he was hurt." "His head was bleeding, pretty badly." Larry nodded slowly, like he was processing this information. "Well, hopefully, he's at a hospital now getting stitched up. These woods can be dangerous at night. Lots of ways to hurt yourself if you're not careful. He was probably just disoriented, didn't know where he was." He said someone was chasing him. "People say a lot of things when they're scared and hurt," Larry replied, his tone becoming soothing again, almost patronizing. "When you're lost in the dark and you've injured yourself, your mind can play tricks on you. He probably heard a coyote or a branch breaking and panicked. It made sense. It was logical and reasonable, and I wanted desperately to believe it. But something felt wrong about the whole thing, about Larry's appearance, about his reaction, about the way he was working so hard to convince me everything was fine. "Where were you last night?" I asked, before I could stop myself. "When I got here, you weren't home." He hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "I went for a walk, like I said. Got back around 11:30, saw you sleeping, didn't want to wake you. That wasn't true. I'd been awake well past midnight, listening for his return. I'd heard the door open after 1 in the morning, had heard him moving around the kitchen getting water, had heard his bedroom door close. And he'd looked like someone who hadn't slept at all, his eyes bloodshot and his movements jerky with exhaustion. But I didn't say any of that. Instead, I nodded and finished gathering my things. I should get home before my parents notice I'm gone. Yeah, probably a good idea. He walked me to the door, his hand on my shoulder in that familiar, affectionate way. Hey, listen. If anyone asks, police or anyone else, I was home all night, okay? I don't want people thinking I was wandering around the woods at night. You know how folks around here talk. I nodded again, my throat tight. Okay, and don't mention that boy to anyone. Not yet, at least. If he really was in trouble, the police will find out soon enough. No need to start rumors that might make things worse for him or his family. Okay, I repeated. He squeezed my shoulder and let me go. I walked home through the early morning light, my breath forming clouds in the frozen air, with a massive knot in my throat that made it hard to swallow. Even then, even with all the signs pointing in one direction, I couldn't let myself understand what they meant, because without Larry, I'd have no one, and being alone felt worse than any alternative I could imagine. So I pushed it down, locked it away, and pretended everything was normal. I didn't tell my parents about the boy, didn't call the police, didn't do anything except return to my routine. School, home, weekends at Larry's place. Over the following weeks and months, nothing seemed different. The boy was never mentioned on the local news. No one came asking questions. Life continued exactly as it had before, and gradually, I convinced myself that Larry had been right. The boy had probably made it to the road, found help, and was fine. Whatever I'd thought I'd seen, I'd misunderstood. That's what I told myself. For years, that's what I told myself. The final straw came last year, when I was 23 and living in the same house I'd grown up in, working part-time at a gas station in town and feeling like I was slowly suffocating. My relationship with Larry had continued all those years, though something had changed after that night in the woods. There was a distance between us that hadn't been there before, an unspoken understanding that we wouldn't talk about certain things. I still visited him regularly, still sat on his couch playing video games or watching movies, but the easy comfort I'd once felt had been replaced by something more complex, more uneasy. He was still kind to me, still the only person in my life who seemed to care whether I existed. But I'd catch him watching me sometimes with an expression I couldn't read, like he was trying to figure out what I was thinking or what I might know. The incident that finally broke through my carefully constructed denial happened on an otherwise unremarkable evening in September. I was at home, scrolling through my phone in bed, unable to sleep as usual, when I stumbled upon a video on YouTube. It was one of those true crime channels that had become popular, where people submit their scary stories and experiences to be narrated by someone with a deep, dramatic voice. This particular video was titled "Hunted in the Woods," and I almost scrolled past it, but something made me tap on it. Maybe just boredom or curiosity, and as the narrator began reading the story, my blood went cold. It was about a boy, 17 years old at the time, who'd been hitchhiking through West Virginia when he'd accepted a ride from a man in a pickup truck. The man had seemed friendly at first, asking normal questions about where the boy was headed and if he needed anything. But then he'd driven off the main roads, going deeper and deeper into the mountains, claiming there was a shortcut. Eventually, they'd ended up at a house in the middle of nowhere, a converted porch attached to a larger building. The man said he needed to grab something inside, invited the boy to come in and get warm while he looked for it. And like an idiot, the boy had agreed, because he was cold and tired, and the man had seemed harmless. Inside, everything changed. The man had attacked him, hitting him across the head with something heavy, and when the boy woke up, he was in a basement with concrete walls and a concrete floor. He was tied to a chair, duct tape across his mouth, and there was a camera set up on a tripod pointed directly at him. The man talked to him while he was tied there, calm, conversational, like they were just having a chat over coffee. He told the boy that he'd done this before, many times, that he'd gotten very good at it. He talked about his process, about how he chose people who wouldn't be missed, drifters and hitchhikers and runaways. He talked about his videos, about the people on the internet who paid good money to watch them, who had specific requests for what they wanted to see. The boy thought he was going to die. He was certain of it, especially when the man left him alone in that basement for what felt like hours, with nothing but his own terror and the blinking red light of the camera for company. But then something had gone wrong. The man had gotten drunk, or careless, or both. He'd left the basement door unlocked when he'd gone upstairs. The boy managed to tip his chair over, break it enough to get his hands free, and run. He'd crashed through the woods in the middle of the night, knowing the man was behind him, hearing footsteps and branches breaking as he was pursued. He'd run into another person, a teenager, and begged for help. That person pointed him toward a road, and he'd followed that direction, running until his lungs burned and his legs gave out. He'd eventually made it to the highway, where a trucker had found him and taken him to a hospital. He'd told the police everything, but they'd never been able to find the house again. The directions he'd given were too vague, the woods too vast and similar everywhere you looked. The narrator finished the story, adding that the boy, now in his 20s, still had nightmares about that night. And then came the detail that made my whole world implode. The boy mentioned a birthmark, a distinctive birthmark on the teenager who'd given him directions. It was on his face, just above his right eyebrow, shaped roughly like a crescent moon. That's how he remembered the person so vividly, because that birthmark had caught the moonlight as they'd stood there in the woods. I have a birthmark above my right eyebrow, shaped like a crescent moon. I've had it my entire life, and it's distinctive enough that people often comment on it when they first meet me. I sat up in bed, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone. I replayed the video 3 times, listening to every detail, and with each replay, the terrible truth became more and more impossible to deny. The house description matched Larry's converted porch exactly. The section of woods near a creek that the boy mentioned was identical to the path I'd walked countless times. The timeline fit perfectly with that night in February when I'd collided with a bloodied teenager in the woods, when Larry had come home, covered in dirt with reddish stains on his face. And the way the story was written, the specific phrasing and word choices, the small details that most people wouldn't think to include, it all felt familiar in a way that made my skin crawl. I'd been listening to Larry talk for over a decade. I knew his speech patterns, his vocabulary, the way he structured stories. This was written by him. I was certain of it. He'd submitted his own crime as a true story, probably getting some sick thrill from seeing it published and narrated and discussed in the comments section. Maybe he thought he was untouchable, that no one would ever make the connection. Or maybe he simply couldn't resist bragging about what he'd done, even anonymously. I couldn't breathe. The room felt too small, the walls pressing in on all sides. All those years, all those visits, all that time spent with someone who had done something so monstrous, and I'd been too blind or too desperate for connection to see it. Worse, I'd helped him, however unintentionally. I'd sent that boy away instead of helping him properly. I'd lied to cover for Larry's absence that night. I'd kept silent about everything I'd seen and heard. For the first time in my life, there was something in me that I couldn't ignore or rationalize away. The video had been posted 8 months earlier, and it had over 500,000 views. This wasn't going to go away. This wasn't something I could pretend hadn't happened. I needed to do something, had to do something. I waited until morning, until my hands had stopped shaking enough to dial the phone, and I called the police. The non-emergency line connected me to a dispatcher who listened as I tried to explain what I'd found, stumbling over my words as I attempted to connect a YouTube video to my uncle to an incident from years ago. She transferred me to an officer, and I started over, trying to be more coherent this time, laying out everything I knew and suspected. There was a long silence when I finished. Then the officer spoke, and his voice was amused, lightly mocking in a way that made my face burn with humiliation. "So let me get this straight," he said, barely containing his laughter. "You saw a video on the internet about something that supposedly happened years ago, and you think your uncle, who you've known your whole life, is some kind of serial killer?" "It matches," I insisted. "Everything matches. The house, the location, the timeline. Kid, do you know how many made-up stories are on the internet? People write fiction all the time and present it as real. It's entertainment. You're wasting department resources with this." "But what if it's true? What if he really did?" "I know your uncle," the officer interrupted. "Larry, right? Been living with your grandparents for years? Guy doesn't even have a parking ticket. You're talking about someone who works from home, keeps to himself, never causes any trouble." The familiarity in his voice when he said Larry's name made everything worse. This was a small community. Everyone knew everyone, and that meant everyone would protect their own, even against evidence. "You should be more careful about where you're sticking your nose," the officer continued, his tone hardening. "Sometimes kids get ideas from the internet, start seeing monsters where there aren't any. I'm going to have a conversation with your uncle. Let him know his nephew is spreading rumors about him. Maybe he can talk some sense into you." The line went dead before I could respond. I sat there holding my phone, feeling like I was going to be sick. He was going to tell Larry. Larry would know I'd called the police, know what I suspected, know that I'd finally put the pieces together. In that moment, I realized several things with terrible clarity. First, that even if my family believed me, which they wouldn't, they would never admit it. They'd close ranks, support Larry over me, cover everything up to maintain appearances with the neighbors and the community. That's what families like mine do. We keep secrets. We hide problems. We present a united front even when the foundation is rotting underneath. Second, that I was in danger. Larry had gotten away with whatever he'd done for years, maybe decades. He wasn't going to let me expose him now. Wasn't going to risk everything because I'd gotten too curious. The officer calling him was like a warning shot, giving him time to prepare, to decide what to do about me. Third, and most importantly, that I had only one option left if I wanted to survive. Something I'd wanted to do for years but never had the courage or the resources to attempt. I had to disappear. I spent the next week preparing in secret. I had some money saved from my job at the gas station. Not much, but enough to get me somewhere far away. I researched cities I'd never been to, places where no one knew me and where I could start over with nothing but the clothes on my back. Wyoming seemed as good as anywhere, a state I'd never even visited, far enough from West Virginia that I could pretend my entire past had never happened. I packed only what I absolutely needed to survive: a backpack with clothes, my important documents, my phone and charger, a few $100s in cash. Everything else I left behind. The room I'd slept in for 23 years, the few possessions I'd accumulated, the life I'd been living, none of it mattered anymore. I didn't say goodbye to anyone. Not to my parents, who probably wouldn't notice I was gone for days. Not to my grandparents, who'd never really acknowledged my existence anyway. And certainly not to Larry, who I was now actively afraid of in a way I'd never been before. In the middle of the night, I walked out the front door of my parents' house and never looked back. I hitched a ride into town, took a bus to Charleston, then another bus west and north and west again, watching the landscape change outside the window as I put mile after mile between myself and the place I'd grown up. I've been in Wyoming for 8 months now. I work at a diner, renting a room in a house with 3 other people who know nothing about me except my first name and the fact that I pay my portion of the rent on time. I don't talk about where I'm from or why I left. I've created a new life here, thin and fragile as paper, but mine. But I can't let it go. Can't stop thinking about what Larry did, about the boy who escaped and the others who maybe didn't. Can't stop wondering how many videos he made, how many people suffered in that basement while I was sleeping on his couch, oblivious or willfully blind. Since arriving here, I've contacted 2 newspapers, trying to get someone to investigate my story. I've sent emails laying out everything I know, every detail and suspicion and connection. Nothing has come of it. They probably think I'm crazy, another conspiracy theorist seeing patterns that don't exist. I know no one will take me seriously until I have concrete proof, something more substantial than a YouTube video and my own terrible memories. And that's what I'm going to get. I've been researching, learning, preparing. I'm going to go back to West Virginia, back to that house, and I'm going to find the evidence that will put Larry away for the rest of his life. I know where he keeps his computer backups, know the layout of his house and the surrounding property. I know his habits and his schedule. I have advantages that the police wouldn't have, even if they were willing to investigate, which they clearly aren't. It's dangerous. I know it's dangerous. Larry might be watching for me, might be prepared for me to return, but I don't have a choice anymore. I can't live with this knowledge. Can't move forward knowing that he's still out there, still free, possibly still hurting people while everyone looks the other way. I know the odds of Larry reading this are slim. He's probably still submitting stories to those YouTube channels, still getting his sick thrills from seeing his crimes narrated and discussed. But there are thousands of stories posted every day. What are the chances he'd see this specific one? But the odds of me seeing and recognizing his story were close to 0 too, and yet here we are. So just in case he does see this, just in case he's reading these words right now, I want to say this directly. I'm coming for you, Larry. I'm coming back, and I'm not that frightened, desperate kid anymore who needed your approval to survive. I'm going to uncover everything you've done, every person you've hurt, every secret you've kept. I'm going to make sure the world knows exactly what you are, and there's nothing you can do to stop me. Not anymore. Back in the summer of 1986, I was about 37 years old and going through what most people would call a complete life transformation. The truth is, I was running. Not from the law, or from debts, or from anything concrete that I could name, but from the weight of everything I'd seen and done in my previous lives. I'd served in the Marine Corps for 6 years, learning discipline and how to survive in conditions most people couldn't imagine. After that, I spent another 7 years as a police officer in Pennsylvania, working the night shift in a mid-sized city where violence was as common as rain. The combination had done something to me. It wasn't just burnout, though that's what I told people when they asked. It was deeper than exhaustion. I'd started to feel hollow inside, like someone had scooped out everything that made me human and left only the shell walking around, going through the motions. I'd wake up in my apartment and couldn't remember driving home from work. I'd find myself standing in the shower, water running cold, with no memory of how long I'd been there. My hands shook when I tried to eat. I stopped answering phone calls from the few friends I had left. One morning, after a particularly rough shift where I'd had to pull a 15-year-old kid out of a car wreck, knowing he wouldn't make it to the hospital, I sat in my patrol car for 3 hours in an empty parking lot. The sun came up. People drove past me on their way to work. And I just sat there, unable to move, unable to think, unable to feel anything at all. That's when I knew I had to leave. Not just the job, but everything. The city, the people, the noise, the constant assault of humanity at its worst. I wanted solitude. I craved it the way a drowning man craves air. I needed space to breathe, room to exist without the weight of other people's tragedies pressing down on me every single day. And more than anything, I wanted to be surrounded by nature, by things that were old and patient and indifferent to human suffering. Trees didn't care about your problems. Mountains didn't judge you for the things you'd done or failed to do. So I packed up my belongings, which didn't amount to much after years of living like a transient even in my own home, and I moved out to rural West Virginia. I had no grand plan, no job lined up, no place to stay. I just knew I needed to be closer to the woods, to places where silence was the default and human voices were the exception. I know that might sound like a strange decision to most people. My colleagues at the police department thought I was having some kind of breakdown. My ex-wife, when I called to tell her, just said she wasn't surprised and hung up. But if you'd walked in my shoes, if you'd seen what I'd seen, if you knew what I'd been through, and trust me when I say that's not something I can explain in a few sentences or even a few hours, it would probably make perfect sense to you. When I told my former colleagues and the few distant relatives I still maintained contact with about the move, no one really questioned it. They just nodded and accepted it without much hesitation. It seemed fitting, somehow. The quiet guy who never talked much about his personal life, moving off to the middle of nowhere. It tracked. It made sense in the narrative people had already constructed about who I was. I found a small cabin to rent about 40 minutes outside of a town called Elkins. The cabin was barely more than 4 walls and a roof, with a wood stove for heat and a well for water. But it was exactly what I needed. No neighbors within sight, no traffic sounds, just the constant whisper of wind through pine trees and the occasional call of birds I couldn't identify. I spent the first month just sitting on the porch, drinking coffee, watching the light change on the mountains across the valley. Some days I wouldn't say a single word out loud. I'd go entire weeks without seeing another human being. After about 6 months of living like that, I realized I needed something to do with my time, some structure to keep me from disappearing entirely into my own head. So I picked up part-time work doing security and odd jobs for the county. Nothing too intense or demanding. Checking on vacant county buildings, helping with prisoner transport occasionally, fixing fences, clearing brush from access roads, the kind of work that kept my body moving but didn't require me to engage with the darker side of human nature anymore. Most of my free time, which was considerable, I spent hiking deep into the mountains. I became particularly drawn to a remote stretch of land up in the Monongahela National Forest, about an hour's drive from my cabin. There was a ridgeline up there that most locals seemed to avoid, though I never quite figured out why. It wasn't marked on any official hiking trails. There were no signs, no blazes on the trees, no indication that anyone had ever thought to make it accessible to the public. It was just raw wilderness, the kind that hasn't changed much in centuries. The deeper you went into that particular section of forest, the more the trees seemed to swallow up your presence. The canopy grew thicker, blocking out more and more sunlight until you were walking in a perpetual twilight, even at noon. The undergrowth became denser, making each step a negotiation with thorns and vines and fallen logs that had been rotting there for decades. And the silence. It was different than the silence at my cabin. This was older, heavier, like the forest itself was holding something in, keeping secrets that predated human presence in these mountains. I know that might sound unsettling to most people. Hell, looking back on it now, it should have unsettled me too, but that feeling, that sense of being small and insignificant beneath those ancient trees, being just another animal passing through something that would exist long after I was gone, that was exactly what I was looking for. It put things in perspective. It made my problems seem temporary and manageable. It reminded me that the world was bigger than the dark corners of human behavior I'd spent so many years navigating. That particular day started off perfect. It was late July, maybe early August. The sun was warm but not oppressive, barely any wind to speak of, and the air had that clean, crisp smell you only get up high in the hills, where the scent of pine and earth and something indefinably wild combines into something almost intoxicating. I hadn't planned on hiking that day. I was supposed to be working a security shift at one of the county facilities, but the supervisor called me mid-morning to say they didn't need me after all. Some kind of scheduling mix-up. I should have been annoyed, should have complained about losing the income, but instead I felt this surge of relief and excitement. It was like the universe had handed me a gift. The weather was too perfect to waste. I stood on my porch, coffee cup in hand, looking at the mountains in the distance, and I knew exactly where I wanted to go. There was a spot about 2 hours up the slope of that unnamed ridgeline I'd only been to once before, years earlier, long before I'd even imagined living in West Virginia. I'd gone up there with a close friend from my Marine Corps days, a guy named Tom Brennan, who'd since passed away while serving overseas. When you spend enough time in those circles, you sort of get used to losing people, no matter how old they are or how careful they try to be. Most of the time, they're just gone one day, and you never really learn the full story of what actually happened. The official reports are always sanitized, stripped of the reality, giving you nothing to hold on to except the fact that someone you knew isn't coming back. But anyway, at that particular moment, standing on my porch with the sun warming my face, it felt like the right time to hike back out to that spot. Maybe it was some kind of memorial to Tom, though I'm not usually sentimental about that kind of thing. Maybe I just wanted to prove to myself that I could still make the climb. Or maybe I was just bored and restless and needed to burn off some energy. I went inside and grabbed my gear. I had an old military compass that I'd carried for years, battered and scratched, but still reliable. I also had a paper map of the area, hand-drawn by a county ranger I'd met at a bar a few months back. He'd marked some of the more interesting features that weren't on the official maps, hidden waterfalls and overlooks and sections of forest that were supposed to be particularly beautiful. I didn't have a GPS back then. Hell, GPS was still mostly military technology in 1986. Not something civilians like me had access to. You navigated the old way, with map and compass and your own sense of direction, and if you got lost, you dealt with it. I also grabbed my sidearm, a Colt 1911 that I'd carried as a police officer and never quite been able to give up. I told myself it was for protection from bears or wild dogs, but the truth was, wearing it just made me feel more secure, more in control. It was a connection to my old life. A reminder that I knew how to handle dangerous situations if they arose. I strapped it to my belt, threw some water and trail mix into a small backpack, and headed out to my Jeep. The drive to the trailhead, or what passed for one, took about 45 minutes on increasingly rough roads. The last 10 minutes were on a dirt track that was barely more than 2 ruts through the underbrush, branches scraping both sides of the Jeep, rocks clanking against the undercarriage. The road dead-ended at a small clearing where someone had dumped an old refrigerator years ago, now rusted and covered in vines. I parked, locked the Jeep out of habit even though I was miles from anywhere, and started hiking. From the start, it was clear this wasn't going to be an easy climb. There was no trail to follow, just forest and elevation gain. I had to pick my way through dense underbrush, stepping over fallen logs, pushing aside branches that whipped back at my face and arms. The ground was uneven, full of loose rocks and hidden holes that could easily twist an ankle if you weren't careful. In some sections, the canopy was so thick that barely any light penetrated, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. After about an hour and a half, I was sweating heavily and breathing hard. I'm in decent shape, always have been, but this kind of hiking demands everything from you. It's not like following a nice, maintained trail where you can find a rhythm and just walk. This required constant attention, constant decision-making about where to place each foot, which route to take around obstacles, whether to go over or around that massive fallen oak blocking your path. I took a break, leaning against a tree trunk and drinking some water, when I first noticed how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind of silence that feels wrong somehow. There should have been birds calling, squirrels rustling through the leaves, insects buzzing, but there was nothing. Just my own breathing and the slight rustle of leaves when the wind managed to penetrate down to ground level. I pushed on, and after another 30 minutes, I hit a slope that immediately felt dangerous. It was way too narrow, maybe only 4 or 5 feet wide, with a steep drop-off on one side and a sheer rock face on the other. The ground was loose shale that shifted and slid under my boots. I've done some risky things in my life, but I'm not stupid. There's brave and there's reckless. And trying to navigate that slope alone, with no one knowing where I was and no way to call for help if something went wrong, that would have been firmly in the reckless category. I pulled out my map and studied the terrain, trying to figure out an alternate route. The map showed a nearby clearing off to the side that looked like it ran parallel to the ridge I was aiming for. It wasn't where I'd originally planned to go, but it seemed safer, and possibly even faster if the ground was more level. I reoriented myself with the compass, took a bearing, and started picking my way through the trees toward the clearing. About 20 minutes later, I found a small stream cutting through the forest, water running clear and cold over smooth rocks. My shirt was soaked with sweat, my throat dry despite the water I'd been drinking. I knelt down by the stream, cupped my hands, and brought the water to my mouth. It tasted clean and pure, with that slight mineral tang you get from mountain springs. I splashed some on my face and the back of my neck, feeling the coolness wash away some of the heat and fatigue. That's when I felt it. That odd sensation of being watched. It's something you develop if you've been in combat or worked in law enforcement. An instinct that tells you when eyes are on you, even if you can't see anyone. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. My breathing changed, became shallower. Without making any sudden movements, I stood up slowly, wiped my hands on my pants, and pulled out my compass, pretending to check my bearings while actually scanning the forest around me. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just trees and shadows and the dappled light filtering through the canopy. Then my eyes caught movement, or maybe not movement exactly, but a shape that didn't quite fit with the natural patterns of the forest. I looked up and to my right, maybe 20 or 30 feet above me on a small rocky ledge that jutted out from the slope, partially hidden behind a gnarled pine tree, barely visible in the shadows. There was a figure. My first thought was that it was just another hiker or maybe a hunter, but something about the way they stood, completely motionless with their heads slightly tilted to one side, made my instinct scream that something was very wrong. They didn't move, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge my presence in any normal human way. They just stood there, staring down at me with an intensity that I could feel even from that distance. As my eyes adjusted to the shadows, I started to make out more details, and each detail made the wrongness more pronounced. Their clothes, if you could call them clothes, looked more like scraps of fabric that had been pieced together without any real plan or purpose. Layers of mismatched material, some of it possibly animal hide, all of it filthy and torn. Their hair was long, hanging well past their shoulders, dark and tangled with what looked like twigs and leaves caught in it. But it was their face that made my blood feel cold in my veins. Their skin was pale, not just pale like someone who doesn't get much sun, but pale in a way that looked wrong, almost gray, like there wasn't a single drop of blood circulating under the surface. The features were human enough, I suppose, 2 eyes, a nose, a mouth, but something about the proportions was off in a way I couldn't quite define. It reminded me of those optical illusions where everything seems normal until you look closer and realize that nothing is quite where it should be. I've spent a lot of time in the woods over the years. I've encountered hermits, drunks who wandered off from town, squatters who'd set up illegal camps on public land, even a few people who were clearly suffering from mental health issues and had gone into the forest to be alone. But this person didn't fit any of those categories. They looked disconnected from reality, like they'd been out there far longer than any sane person should be, like they'd forgotten what it meant to be human. But even as I thought that, another part of my brain was insisting that this wasn't a person at all. It had the shape of one, sure, the basic outline and structure, but that skin, that absolutely unnatural pallor, the way they stood so perfectly still without even the slight swaying that every human has when they stand in one place, it all suggested something else, something that only looked human from a distance. Then there was a slight movement, barely perceptible, just a small shift in the shadows behind the first figure. My eyes snapped to it, focusing past that initial shape, and I realized with growing horror that there was another one. This second figure was partially obscured by a larger bush, only their head and shoulders visible, but I could see their eyes clearly. They were this completely unnatural shade of blue, bright and intense even in the dim light under the trees, a blue so vivid it looked almost luminescent, like light was coming from behind them. I know I probably sound crazy describing it this way. I know people are going to think I was dehydrated or suffering from heat exhaustion or that my mind was playing tricks on me, but I swear on everything I hold sacred that this is exactly what I saw. Those eyes were not human. They couldn't be. No human being has eyes that color, that intensity, that seem to generate their own light. My hand went to my sidearm automatically, years of training taking over when my conscious mind was too stunned to think clearly. As soon as my fingers touched the grip, the first figure moved. It didn't walk or turn or make any normal human movement. It just stepped backward and vanished behind the tree. And I mean vanished. One moment visible and the next completely gone, faster than should be possible. I drew my weapon, thumbing off the safety, and aimed at where the figure had been. My hands were steady. Whatever else was happening, my body remembered its training, but there was nothing to aim at now. Both figures had disappeared completely. The ledge looked empty, just rock and trees and shadows. No movement, no sound. Acting more on instinct than rational thought, I looked around for a better vantage point. About 15 feet away was a large oak tree with low branches and good spacing between them. I holstered my weapon, keeping the snap undone for quick access, and climbed. The bark was rough under my hands, and my boots struggled to find purchase on the trunk, but I managed to pull myself up to a branch about 10 feet off the ground. From there, I had a much clearer view of the ledge where I'd seen the figures. There was nothing there, no sign that anyone had been standing in that spot, no disturbed leaves, no footprints in the thin layer of soil on the rock, nothing. I sat on that branch for what felt like forever, but was probably only 10 or 15 minutes, watching and listening. My ears strained for any sound, any indication of where those things had gone, but the forest remained completely silent. That's when it really hit me, the silence. Every single normal forest sound had stopped. No birds singing, no insects buzzing, no squirrels chattering, no wind rustling through leaves, nothing. Just dead, oppressive silence pressing in from all sides. I've been in the woods thousands of times. I know what normal quiet sounds like. This wasn't that. This was the kind of silence that happens when something dangerous is nearby, when every living thing in the area is holding perfectly still, trying not to attract attention. The woods go quiet when there's a predator present. Every hunter knows that. Every animal knows that. And right then, sitting in that tree with my hand on my weapon and my heart hammering in my chest, I knew with absolute certainty that I needed to get out of there. The rational part of my brain tried to argue that I was overreacting, that they were just homeless people or maybe victims of some kind of abuse who'd fled into the woods, but my instincts, honed by years of combat and police work, were screaming at me to run. I also realized that while I'd been focused on the ledge and the figures, the sun had moved significantly. The light had changed, grown dimmer, more orange. Shadows had lengthened. I checked my watch and was shocked to see that it was already past 5 in the afternoon. I'd been hiking for hours, and I was deep in the forest with at least a 2-hour hike back to my Jeep, maybe longer if I couldn't retrace my route exactly. The last thing I wanted was to be out here in the dark with those creatures, because that's what they were. Creatures, not people, still in the area. I climbed down from the tree as quietly as I could, every nerve in my body on high alert. When my boots touched the ground, I paused, listening again. Still nothing, just that terrible, oppressive silence. I started moving, trying to retrace my path back down the slope toward where I'd left my Jeep. I wasn't running, not yet, but I was moving fast, pushing through underbrush without worrying about the noise I was making, just wanting to put distance between myself and whatever I'd seen on that ledge. I'd gone maybe a quarter mile when I heard it, a crack, loud and sharp, like a massive tree trunk splitting in half. It echoed through the forest, coming from somewhere behind and above me. I froze, every muscle locked, listening. The sound was followed by a deep, resonating crash, like something enormous hitting the ground. But here's what made it truly terrifying. When that crash faded, the silence returned. There should have been other sounds, birds taking flight from the noise, small animals fleeing, branches settling, something. But there was nothing, just silence. And silence meant those things were still out there, still hunting, because that's what they were doing now. I understood that on a primal level. They were hunting me. I looked around, trying to figure out where the sound had come from, whether I should change direction or keep going. That's when I heard the second sound, and this one turned my legs to water. It was like a rattlesnake, but impossibly loud, so loud it seemed to vibrate through the air itself. Except rattlesnakes don't get that loud. Nothing natural gets that loud. To make that much noise, you'd need a rattlesnake the size of a bus. The sound was coming from upslope, back the way I'd come. I turned slowly, my weapon already in my hand, though I didn't remember drawing it. And there they were, the two figures I'd seen earlier, standing side by side on a rocky outcropping about 50 yards away. Their heads were tilted back, mouths open impossibly wide, and that rattling sound was coming from them, from inside them. They were making that noise. I felt frozen, completely paralyzed, unable to move or think or do anything except stare at them in absolute horror. Their mouths were too wide. Human jaws don't open that far. And the sound, it was getting louder, more intense, and I realized with dawning terror that it was some kind of call. They were calling to others. Movement in my peripheral vision broke the paralysis. I jerked my head to the left and saw a third figure, identical to the first two, running toward them through the forest. Not jogging, not walking quickly. Running at full speed, leaping over obstacles, moving with an agility and speed that no human could match. When it reached the other two, all three turned their attention to me. That's when understanding crashed over me like a wave of ice water. They weren't just watching me. They weren't just curious. They were hunting me. This was coordinated, organized. They'd spread out, tracked me, and now they were closing in. I was the prey, and they were the predators, and I was in their territory, miles from help, with night coming on fast. I fired my weapon. I didn't aim carefully. I just pointed in their general direction and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, impossibly loud in the silent forest, the recoil familiar and almost comforting in its normalcy. I had no idea if I hit anything. I didn't wait to find out. I just turned and ran. I ran like I've never run before or since. I ran like my life depended on it, because it did. I crashed through underbrush that tore at my clothes and skin. I leaped over logs without looking at what might be on the other side. I slid down slopes on loose dirt and rocks, barely staying upright. My lungs burned. My legs screamed. My heart felt like it was going to explode in my chest. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. Behind me, I could hear them moving through the forest. They weren't being quiet anymore. There was no need. They knew I knew they were there. I could hear branches breaking, hear that terrible rattling sound rising and falling, hear what might have been breathing or might have been something else entirely. They were fast, faster than me. It was only a matter of time before they caught me. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning. Every second stretched into an eternity. Every step could have been my last. My mind kept showing me images of what they might do when they caught me. Those pale faces, those inhuman eyes, those mouths opening wider than any mouth should. I knew they were going to catch me. There was no way I could outrun them all the way back to my jeep. This was their territory. They knew every tree, every rock, every hollow, and I was exhausted, already slowing down, while they seemed tireless. Then I heard it. Water. Running water. Not the gentle burble of a stream, but the rush of a river. Somewhere ahead and to my right. I changed direction, crashing through a stand of saplings, and suddenly I was on a bank looking down at fast-moving water. It wasn't huge, maybe 30 feet across, but it was moving fast, swollen from recent rains, white water breaking over rocks. I didn't think. There was no time to think. I could hear those things getting closer, could hear that rattling sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I looked at the water, looked back at the dark forest where my death was approaching, and I made my choice. I'd rather drown than die at the hands of those creatures. At least drowning would be relatively quick. I jumped. The water hit me like a physical blow, cold enough to drive the air from my lungs. The current grabbed me immediately, pulling me under, tumbling me over rocks. I fought to get my head above water, managed one gasping breath before going under again. My boots filled with water, heavy as anchors. My backpack dragged at my shoulders. My weapon, still somehow in my hand, felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I broke the surface again, coughing and gasping, and saw them, all three of them, standing on the bank I'd just jumped from, watching me get swept away. They didn't follow. They just stood there, motionless, their heads tilted in that unsettling way, watching me disappear downstream. For reasons I still don't understand, they stayed on the bank. Maybe they couldn't swim. Maybe they didn't like water. Maybe they'd lost interest once I'd left their territory. I'll never know. The river carried me for what felt like miles, but was probably only a few hundred yards before the current started to slow. My body was shutting down. The adrenaline that had kept me moving was wearing off, and exhaustion was crashing over me like another wave. I tried to swim toward the shore, but my arms wouldn't cooperate. They just flailed uselessly at the water. Somehow, I don't remember exactly how, I managed to grab onto a root or branch that was hanging over the water. I held on with the last of my strength, pulling myself toward the bank, crawling more than swimming. When I felt mud under my hands, I dragged myself onto shore and just lay there, unable to move, barely able to breathe. That's the last thing I remember clearly. The cold mud against my face, the sound of my own labored breathing, the weight of my soaked clothes pulling me down, and then nothing. Just darkness. I woke up to sunlight and the smell of wood smoke. For a moment, I had no idea where I was or what had happened. Then the pain hit. Every muscle in my body screamed. My head throbbed. My lungs felt like someone had filled them with ground glass. I tried to move and managed only a small groan. "Easy now," a voice said. Male, older, with a thick mountain accent. "You've been through hell. Don't try to move just yet." I forced my eyes to focus. I was lying on something soft, a cot or bed, in a small cabin. Rough wooden walls, a stone fireplace with a fire crackling, windows showing dense forest outside. A man was sitting in a chair near the bed, maybe in his 60s, weathered face, white beard, wearing clothes that looked like they'd been patched and repatched dozens of times. "Where am I?" I managed to croak out. My throat felt like I'd swallowed gravel. "My place," he said. "Found you on the riverbank yesterday morning. You're lucky I was out checking my traps. Another hour or two in that state, you'd have died from exposure. Yesterday morning, I'd lost an entire night. I had vague memories of darkness, of being unable to move, of cold seeping into my bones. "My Jeep," I said. "I need to get back to my Jeep." "That can wait," a woman's voice said. I turned my head, wincing at the movement, and saw an older woman, probably the man's wife, coming toward the bed with a bowl of something that smelled wonderful. "First, you need to eat and drink. Get your strength back. Then we'll worry about your vehicle." Over the next 2 days, they took care of me like I was their own son. I learned their names were George and Martha Pruitt, and they'd lived in these mountains their entire lives, just like their parents and grandparents before them. They'd built this cabin themselves 30 years ago, lived off the land mostly, with occasional trips into town for supplies they couldn't make or grow themselves. Martha fed me soup and bread, strong tea with honey, venison stew that brought feeling back to my limbs. George helped me to the outhouse when I needed it, never complaining about supporting most of my weight. They asked no questions about what I was doing in the river or why I looked like I'd been to war and back. They just took care of me with quiet efficiency and genuine kindness. On the second evening, as I sat in front of the fire, wrapped in blankets, finally feeling almost human again, I told George what had happened. I kept my voice low, not wanting to worry Martha, and I tried to make it sound less insane than it felt. But George didn't look surprised or skeptical. He just nodded slowly, staring into the flames. "You went up on the ridge," he said finally. "Not a question, a statement." "The ridge?" I asked. "That's what we call it," he said. "The high country up above Falls Creek. Most folks around here know better than to go up there. There's things in those mountains that don't take kindly to visitors." "You've seen them?" I asked. "Those things?" George was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I've seen enough to know that some parts of these mountains are best left alone. My grandfather used to tell stories about them. Called them the Gray Walkers. Said they'd been in these hills longer than anyone could remember. They keep to themselves mostly, long as you don't wander into their territory." "But what are they?" I pressed. "Are they human? Were they human once?" "Don't know," George said. "Don't much care to find out either. Some things, it's better not to know too much about. You survive an encounter like that, you count your blessings, and you don't go back. That's what I'd recommend." The next morning, George loaded me into his old pickup truck and drove me back to where I'd left my Jeep. The drive took almost 2 hours on winding mountain roads I didn't recognize. When we finally pulled up next to my vehicle, sitting undisturbed in that small clearing, it felt like seeing an old friend. Before I got out, George put a hand on my arm. "Listen to me," he said, his voice serious. "What happened to you up there? Forget about it. Don't go looking for explanations. Don't go telling people, and for God's sake, don't go back up there. Those things, whatever they are, They've been in these mountains since before your granddaddy was born, and they'll be here long after you're gone. They don't come down here to our part of the forest. As long as you stay out of their territory, you're safe. You understand?" I nodded, even though I wasn't sure I agreed. Part of me wanted to report what I'd seen, to warn people, to do something. But another part of me, the part that was still terrified, that still saw those pale faces and those impossible eyes every time I closed my own eyes, that part knew George was right. "Thank you," I said, "for everything. I'd be dead if you hadn't found me." George just nodded. "You take care of yourself," he said, "and remember what I told you." I got into my Jeep, which started on the first try despite sitting there for days. As I drove away, I watched George's truck disappear back down the mountain road, and I made a decision. I was going to forget this ever happened. I was going to put it out of my mind and never think about it again. And for the most part, that's what I did. I moved away from West Virginia 6 months later, couldn't stand to be near those mountains anymore, even though I'd loved them once. I went back to Pennsylvania, took a job doing private security, eventually remarried, lived what most people would call a normal life. But I never really forgot. How could I? Those faces haunted my dreams. That rattling sound echoed in my head during quiet moments, and I never went hiking alone again. Never wandered into deep forest without multiple people with me. Never let myself get far from civilization. I'm an old man now. I've lived most of my life trying to convince myself that what happened was just a hallucination brought on by dehydration and exhaustion and the trauma I was carrying from my years in the Marines and the police force. Some days, I almost believe that. Almost. But then I remember the absolute certainty I felt in that moment when I saw them on that ledge. The bone-deep knowledge that I was looking at something that shouldn't exist but did. The terror that drove me to throw myself into a river rather than let them catch me. I'm telling this story now because I'm old enough that I don't care what people think anymore. I don't care if you believe me or think I'm crazy or senile. I know what I saw. I know what happened. And if sharing this story keeps even one person from wandering up into that particular section of the Monongahela National Forest, from stumbling into territory that belongs to something older and stranger and more dangerous than any of us can imagine, then it's worth people thinking I've lost my mind. There are places in this world that aren't meant for human beings. There are things living in the deep woods that we're better off never meeting. And if you're smart, if you value your life and your sanity, you'll stay out of places like the Ridge. Because they're still up there. I know they are, and they're waiting. The first body we found had been partially eaten. I remember standing there in the October frost, my breath forming clouds in the air, staring at what remained of Luke Harrison. His backpack lay torn open 50 feet from where we discovered him, the contents scattered like confetti across the forest floor. Energy bars, a water bottle, a compass, all untouched. But Luke himself. Luke was different. The park rangers who'd called us in, Silas and Vincent, stood back with their hands over their mouths, their faces the color of old snow. "Nothing in these mountains does this," Silas whispered, his voice cracking. He'd been patrolling these ridges for 23 years. Not even a starving bear. I was there because I specialized in unusual predator patterns, brought in by the Appalachian Search and Rescue after 3 hikers vanished in 2 weeks. The National Park Service was desperate but quiet about it, didn't want to cause a panic, didn't want the media descending on their trails like vultures. My team consisted of 6 people: myself, my research partner Emily, tracking expert Carter, survival specialist Grayson, and 2 local guides who knew these mountains like the backs of their weathered hands, Damien and Theodore, though everyone called him Ted. The coordinates where Luke had disappeared marked a section of trail that wound through some of the most remote territory in the Appalachian Range. The locals called it the Hunger Hollows, a name that stretched back generations, though nobody could quite remember why. Old maps simply labeled it Restricted Area, and the few rangers willing to talk about it mentioned strange sounds in winter, when the wind came down from the peaks like a living thing. "We should camp before dark," Emily said, checking her watch. It was only 3 in the afternoon, but the sun was already dropping behind the ridgeline, plunging the valley into premature twilight. The shadows here seemed darker than they should be, as if the forest itself was swallowing the light. We set up our tents in a clearing about a mile from where we'd found Luke, close enough to begin a proper investigation at first light, but far enough, we hoped, to avoid whatever had killed him. Damien built the fire while Carter strung up our supplies, hanging the food bags high in the trees despite Grayson's muttered comment that whatever we were dealing with probably didn't care about bear-proofing protocols. As darkness fell, the forest changed. During the day, you could hear birds, the rustle of small mammals in the underbrush, the normal symphony of life that filled these woods. But night brought something else entirely, a silence so complete it felt like being underwater. No owls called, no branches creaked. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. "Tell me about the other two," I said to Ted, who was staring into the fire with the kind of far-off expression that suggested he was seeing more than just flames. He pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders. First one was a solo hiker, Nathan Brody, 34 years old, experienced mountaineer. He called his wife from the summit, said he was starting his descent, never made it to his car. We found his tent 3 days later, set up proper and neat, sleeping bag laid out, cookware organized, like he'd just stepped away for a moment and never came back. And the second? "Brothers," Vincent cut in, his voice tight. "Connor and Dylan Walsh, college kids doing a weekend trip, their campsite. We found Connor's boot with his foot still in it. Dylan we never found at all, just blood. So much blood, it stained the rocks black." Emily moved closer to the fire. "You're saying something is hunting people, something that takes them at night." "I'm saying," Ted replied slowly, "that my grandfather used to tell stories about these mountains, about things that lived here before settlers came, before the Cherokee built their villages in the valleys, things that got hungry when the winters were long." He paused, his eyes catching the firelight. He said some hungers never die, they just sleep, waiting for the right kind of cold to wake them up. Grayson laughed, but it sounded forced. "You're talking about folklore, ghost stories. I'm talking about what killed Luke Harrison," Ted snapped. "And if you're smart, you'll treat it with respect instead of mockery, boy." The tension hung heavy between them until Carter stood abruptly. "I'm going to check the perimeter one more time before bed. Emily, come with me." They disappeared into the darkness beyond our firelight, their flashlight beams cutting through the trees like pale fingers. I watched them go, that old familiar feeling settling into my gut, the one that said something was wrong, that we'd walked into a situation we didn't fully understand. 20 minutes later, Carter came running back alone. "Emily," he gasped, his face white with terror. "She was right behind me. I swear she was right behind me." And then, he spun around, pointing his flashlight into the forest. I heard this sound, this voice. It was calling my name, but it wasn't. It wasn't right. The words were wrong, like someone speaking backwards. And when I turned around, "Where is she?" I demanded, already grabbing my gear. "I don't know," she screamed, and I ran back, but she was gone. Just gone. There wasn't even a sound cut through the night. It started as a low moan, rising in pitch until it became a shriek that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was agony given voice, starvation made into sound, a wail that spoke of endless hunger and desperate need. And underneath it, woven through it like thread through cloth, I heard Emily's voice calling for help. "Nobody move," Damien commanded, his rifle already in his hands. His face had gone hard, all the warmth of the campfire companion replaced by something ancient and knowing. "That's not your friend out there. Not anymore." The shriek came again, closer this time, and I understood with horrible clarity what Ted's grandfather had been trying to warn about. "Some hungers," he'd said, "never die." We were about to meet one face to face. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes. Our breath came out in thick plumes as we huddled around the fire, weapons drawn, listening to Emily's voice call from the darkness. Except it wasn't quite her voice, not really. The cadence was off, the vowels stretched too long, the consonants clicking in ways that human mouths shouldn't be able to produce. "Please," the thing wearing Emily's voice pleaded. "It hurts. Help me. Why won't you help me?" Carter was shaking so badly his flashlight beam jerked across the trees like a strobe light. "We have to do something. We can't just leave her out there." "That's not her," Damien repeated, his voice hard as iron. "Listen to me, all of you. My people have stories about this. The Wendigo, the spirit of winter, hunger, of famine and cannibalism. It takes people and wears them like masks, uses their voices to lure others into the dark." "That's insane," Grayson protested, but his voice wavered. "Is it?" Vincent gestured toward where Luke's body lay beneath a tarp. "You saw what happened to him. Something ate him alive while he was still screaming. The claw marks on the trees near his campsite, they were 8 feet high. What bear stands 8 feet tall?" The voice came again, circling our camp now, moving through the forest with impossible speed. One moment it called from the north, Emily begging us to find her, and the next it was south of us, her words dissolving into laughter that sounded like breaking ice. I forced myself to think through the terror clouding my mind. If it's hunting us, Why doesn't it just attack? Why the games? Because it wants us scattered, Ted said quietly. Wants us to run, to separate, to make mistakes. One by one, it'll pick us off. That's how it feeds not just on flesh, but on fear. He fed another log into the fire, sending sparks spiraling into the black sky. Fire keeps it at bay. It hates warmth, hates life. As long as we stay together and keep the flames burning, we might survive until dawn. And then what? I asked. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes said everything. Dawn was 6 hours away, and we had maybe 3 hours worth of firewood. An hour passed, then 2. We took turns feeding the fire, rationing our wood, trying not to think about what would happen when it ran out. The voice in the darkness had gone quiet, which somehow felt worse than the calling. At least when it was speaking, we knew where it was. Grayson broke first. I can't take this anymore. I'm going to make a run for the vehicles. They're only 3 miles down the trail. If I move fast, you'll be dead before you make it 100 yards, Damien interrupted. Better than sitting here waiting to die. Grayson, no, I started. But he was already moving, grabbing his pack and bolting into the forest, his flashlight beam bouncing wildly between the trees. We heard him for maybe 30 seconds, his footsteps crashing through undergrowth, his ragged breathing, his whispered curses. Then came the sound of branches snapping, a surprised shout, and a scream that cut off with horrifying abruptness. The silence that followed was worse than any sound. 4 left, Vincent whispered, his voice hollow. Carter stood up, his face twisted with rage and grief. This is insane. We can't just sit here. He kicked at the fire, sending embers flying. We should be tracking it, hunting it, fighting back instead of cowering like prey? Ted finished for him. That's what we are, son. That's all we've ever been. Something moved at the edge of our firelight. Not Emily, not Grayson. Something else, something tall. It stood just beyond the reach of the flames, a shape that suggested a human form the way a skeleton suggests a body. Too thin, all wrong proportions, arms that hung nearly to its knees and fingers that ended in blackened claws. Its skin was the color of old snow, stretched tight over jutting bones. But the worst part was the head, the skull of what might have once been human, now elongated and crowned with massive antlers that branched up into the darkness like a grotesque parody of a tree. The Wendigo tilted its head, studying us with eyes that burned with a pale blue light like corpse fire. When it opened its mouth, I saw rows of broken, jagged teeth, stained dark with old blood. Its breath came out in clouds of frost that crystallized in the air. "Run," Damien said softly. "When I give the signal, everyone run for the emergency shelter. It's a 1/4 mile northeast. Stone building, walls 3 feet thick, old hunting cabin from the Civil War era. If we can reach it." The creature stepped forward, and Carter opened fire. The gunshots were deafening in the quiet forest, muzzle flash lighting up the night like lightning. I saw the bullets hit, saw the impacts punch through the Wendigo's chest, but it didn't stop. It didn't even slow. It just kept coming, moving with a horrible stuttering gait that defied natural movement, here one moment and 3 feet closer the next, as if it was skipping through space itself. "Now!" Damien roared, and we ran. The forest was a nightmare of reaching branches and hidden roots. I could hear the others crashing through the underbrush around me, could hear Vincent praying in Spanish, could hear the wet, eager sounds the Wendigo made as it pursued us. Behind us, Carter was still firing, still screaming defiance, until suddenly he wasn't screaming anymore. "There!" Ted shouted, pointing toward a structure barely visible through the trees. The old shelter materialized out of the darkness like a tombstone, rough stone walls, narrow windows, a heavy wooden door hanging askew on ancient hinges. We burst through the entrance, Damien slamming the door behind us and throwing the rusted bolt. The shelter smelled of mold and decay, but the walls were solid. Through the gaps in the door, I could see the pale shape of the Wendigo pacing outside, circling the building like a shark. "Will it hold?" I gasped, my lungs burning. "It held during the war," Ted replied, but he didn't sound confident. "Held against Confederate raiders, held against—" The door exploded inward. The Wendigo's arm thrust through the shattered wood, those terrible claws grasping blindly. Vincent screamed and stumbled backward, falling hard against the far wall. The creature's face appeared in the opening, that inhuman skull with its crown of antlers, its burning eyes fixing on us with pure, mindless hunger. Damien shot it point blank in the face. The Wendigo recoiled, shrieking, and in that moment of respite, I saw something that made my blood run cold. On the far wall, scratched into the stone by countless desperate hands over countless years, were warnings. The hunger walks in winter. Do not speak its name. Do not answer its call. Burn the bones. And below that, fresher than the rest, recent enough that the stone dust still lay on the floor. It took Sarah. It took Michael. It will take you too. L.H. Luke. Luke Harrison had been here, had known what was coming for him. The bones, I said, my mind racing. Ted, your grandfather's stories. How do you kill a Wendigo? You don't, he replied grimly. You can only burn the bones, I finished, understanding flooding through me. It's not just a creature. It's a spirit bound to physical remains. Somewhere in these mountains, there are bones keeping it anchored here. The Wendigo's arm thrust through the door again, grabbing Vincent by the ankle. He shrieked, clawing at the floor as it dragged him toward the opening. Damien and I grabbed his arms, pulling back in a horrible tug of war while Vincent screamed and screamed and screamed. We lost. Vincent was pulled through the door in a spray of blood, and the last thing I heard was his voice, already changing, already being consumed by the thing that had taken Emily and Grayson and Carter, becoming another echo, another lure, another face for the hunger to wear. 3 of us remained, barricaded in a stone tomb in the heart of the Appalachian darkness, while outside, the Wendigo waited with the patience of winter itself. Dawn was still 2 hours away when Ted found the trapdoor. It was hidden beneath centuries of dirt and leaves in the corner of the shelter, a crude opening that led down into darkness. Cold air wafted up from below, carrying with it the smell of earth and something else, something ancient and rotten. Tunnels, Ted said, running his flashlight beam down into the hole. The old rangers used to talk about cave systems under these mountains. If we can navigate them, maybe we can come up somewhere away from that thing. Or maybe we'll get lost underground and die in the dark, Damien countered, but his voice was resigned. We all knew we didn't have a choice. The Wendigo was still outside, and it wasn't leaving. Through the broken door, we could see it standing motionless in the pre-dawn gloom, its antlered head tilted upward as if tasting the air. I went first, lowering myself into the tunnel with Ted's flashlight clenched between my teeth. The passage was narrow and rough, carved not by water but by human hands or something like human hands. Scratch marks scored the walls, deep gouges that suggested desperate digging, frantic escape. We descended for what felt like forever, the tunnel spiraling down into the mountain's heart. The air grew colder the deeper we went, until frost began forming on the walls and our breath came out in solid clouds. My flashlight beam caught something ahead and opening into a larger chamber. I emerged into a cave that defied natural formation. The walls were covered in bones, not stacked, not arranged, embedded, pressed into the stone as if the rock had grown around them, consuming them, making them part of the mountain itself. Hundreds of bones, maybe thousands. Skulls with antlers sprouting from their crowns. Rib cages that belonged to things that had never been fully human. Finger bones that were too long, too sharp, too numerous. And in the center of the chamber, arranged in a perfect circle, were 9 skulls. Recent enough that traces of flesh still clung to them. Recent enough that I could recognize them. Nathan Brody, Connor Walsh, Dylan Walsh, and 6 others I didn't know, but whose faces stared out from missing person posters that had been circulating through the Park Service for months. The anchors, I whispered. These are the bones keeping it bound here. Ted and Damien emerged from the tunnel behind me, both freezing when they saw what I'd found. Damien's face had gone completely white. Those are Wendigo victims. Once it feeds on someone completely, their bones become part of its power. They tie it to this place, let it keep hunting. So we destroy them, I said. We burn them like the warning said. With what? Ted asked, but he was already pulling supplies from his pack, emergency flares, waterproof matches, a small bottle of camp fuel. We use everything we've got and hope it's enough. We worked quickly, arranging the skulls in the center of the chamber, dousing them with fuel, surrounding them with every flammable thing we could find in our packs. The whole time, I felt like something was watching us, like the mountain itself was holding its breath. I struck the match. The flames caught instantly, roaring up in a column of heat and light that filled the chamber. The skulls began to burn, and as they did, a sound filled the cave, a shriek of pure rage and agony that seemed to come from the walls themselves. The bones embedded in the stone began to crack, spider webs of fractures racing across their surfaces. "It's working," Damien shouted over the roar of the fire. The Wendigo came through the tunnel like a bullet. It was different now, desperate, its movements wild and uncontrolled. The careful hunter was gone, replaced by pure animal fury. It fell on Damien before any of us could react, its claws opening his throat in a spray of red. He dropped without a sound. Ted and I ran, fleeing deeper into the cave system as the fire behind us grew higher and the Wendigo's shrieks became screams of dying. We ran through tunnels that twisted and branched, ran until our lungs burned and our legs trembled, ran until finally we burst out of a cave mouth on the side of the mountain just as the sun crested the ridge. The light hit us like a physical thing, warm, golden, alive. Behind us, from deep within the mountain, came one final scream, then silence. The bones had burned. The anchor was broken. The hunger was ended. They found us 3 hours later, 2 park rangers named Joshua and Adrian who'd been part of the expanded search when we didn't check in. We told them about an animal attack, about getting separated from the group, about Damien making a last stand to let us escape. They believed us because the alternative was too terrible to believe. They never found the bodies. Not completely. They recovered enough of Carter and Grayson to confirm their deaths. Found Vincent's jacket soaked in blood. Emily, Luke, and the others remained missing. Their cases eventually filed as presumed dead due to exposure and wildlife attack. The shelter was demolished. The cave entrance was sealed with concrete and marked as hazardous. The Hunger Hollow section of trail was permanently closed to the public. Official reason listed as geological instability. Ted and I never spoke about what really happened. We didn't need to. Some truths are better left unspoken, buried as deep as the bones we destroyed. But sometimes, on cold winter nights when the wind comes down from the mountains, I wake up convinced I can hear Emily's voice calling from the darkness, calling my name in that wrong way, those stretched vowels and clicking consonants. And I remember the Wendigo's eyes, burning like corpse fire in the dark. I remember that hunger never really dies, it just sleeps, waiting for the next long winter to wake it again. The Appalachian Mountains keep their secrets well, and some secrets, I've learned, are meant to stay buried in the stone and snow, warnings for those foolish enough to wander too deep into the places where the old things still dwell, where the hunger still waits, where winter never truly ends. I should have known something was wrong when we found the abandoned campsite on the second day of our trek. The tent was shredded from the inside out, and there were scratch marks on the trees that started at 8 feet off the ground and dragged downward, as if something impossibly tall had been clawing its way toward the earth. But I was young then, 23 and fearless, convinced that the Appalachian wilderness held nothing I couldn't handle. My name is Julian, and I was leading 7 friends deeper into the mountains than any of us had ever gone before. The group had come together through a hiking club at the community center back in Asheville. There was Grayson, my closest friend since childhood, built like a linebacker but gentle as they come. His girlfriend Evelyn had insisted on coming, despite having never camped a day in her life before this trip. Then there were the twins, Nolan and Adrian, competitive about everything and always trying to prove who was the better outdoorsman. We'd also brought along Hazel, a quiet girl who worked at the outdoor supply store and knew these mountains better than any of us, and her friend Claire, who documented everything with her camera. Rounding out our group was Vincent, an older guy in his 40s who'd been coming to the hiking club meetings for months, always with stories about the deep wilderness that made the rest of us feel like amateurs. The trail we'd chosen was an old one, barely maintained, that wound through some of the most remote sections of the Cherokee National Forest. The map showed it leading to Raven's Peak, an overlook that promised views stretching 50 miles in every direction. Vincent had been the one to suggest it, his eyes gleaming with something I'd mistaken for enthusiasm when he'd spread the map across the community center table 3 weeks earlier. We'd set out from the trailhead at dawn, our packs heavy with supplies for 5 days in the backcountry. The first day had been perfect, exactly what I'd imagined when I'd planned this trip. The forest was alive with birdsong, sunlight filtered through the canopy in golden shafts, and the trail, though challenging, felt manageable. We'd made camp that first night beside a crystal-clear stream, cooking our dinner over the fire while swapping stories and watching stars emerge in a sky untainted by city lights. But the second day brought changes, subtle at first. The birdsong grew quieter as we climbed higher, until by afternoon we hiked through an unsettling silence, broken only by our footsteps and labored breathing. The temperature dropped faster than it should have for September, and by the time we reached the abandoned campsite, our breath was misting in the air. "Someone left in a hurry," Nolan observed, prodding the torn tent with his hiking pole. The fabric looked as if it had been attacked by a bear, except the tears went in the wrong direction, and there was no blood. "Those scratches on the trees," Hazel said quietly, her face pale as she studied the deep gouges in the bark. "That's not right. Nothing in these mountains does that. Vincent stood apart from us, staring up the trail ahead with an expression I couldn't quite read. When he noticed me watching, he smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We should keep moving," he said. "We want to make Raven's Peak before dark." Something in his tone made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, but I pushed the feeling aside. We were committed now, too far in to turn back in one day, and the thought of retracing our steps through that oppressive silence was somehow worse than continuing forward. We hiked for 3 more hours, the trail growing steeper and more overgrown. The trees pressed in close, their branches forming a ceiling that blocked out most of the afternoon light. Adrian twisted his ankle on a hidden root, and we had to slow our pace, supporting him between Grayson and me. By the time we emerged onto the rocky outcropping of Raven's Peak, the sun was already sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked too much like fire. The view should have been breathtaking. Rolling mountains stretched endlessly in every direction, their peaks fading into blue-gray mist. But there was something wrong with the silence here, too. No wind rustled the trees below us. No birds called out their evening songs. The world felt held in suspension, waiting for something. "We'll camp here tonight," I announced, trying to inject confidence into my voice. "Set up the tents in that clearing just back from the edge." As we unpacked and began setting up camp, Evelyn drew close to Grayson, her voice low and urgent. I heard fragments of their conversation drift over to me. "Want to go back? Something wrong with this place." But Grayson soothed her fears the way he always did, his deep voice a rumble of reassurance. Claire had wandered to the edge of the overlook, her camera forgotten at her side as she stared down into the darkening forest. I joined her, following her gaze. "Do you see it?" she whispered. At first, I saw nothing but trees and gathering shadows. Then I noticed it, a wrongness in the pattern of the forest canopy, a section where the trees looked dead or dying, their branches bare and skeletal in a rough circular pattern maybe half a mile below us. It looked like some kind of blight had struck that area, leaving a wound in the otherwise unbroken sea of green. "What could do that?" Claire asked. I had no answer. But as the sun dipped below the mountains and true darkness began to settle over Raven's Peak, I found myself unable to look away from that dead zone. And that's when I saw the first movement down there in the shadows, something impossibly tall and thin slipping between the dead trees, there and gone so quickly I might have imagined it. Vincent had appeared beside us without a sound. "We should get a fire going," he said. "It's going to be a cold night." That night, as we sat around the fire eating our freeze-dried meals, Vincent told us stories. He spoke of the old legends, the tales the Cherokee people had told about these mountains long before settlers arrived. He talked about creatures that lived in the deepest wilderness, things that had been hungry since the dawn of time. "There's one story," he said, his face half-shadowed in the firelight, "about a spirit that embodies the worst of human nature: greed, hunger, the willingness to consume others to survive. The indigenous people called it by different names, but the idea was always the same. Once it touches you, you become like it, always hungry, never satisfied, forever searching for the next meal." "That's cheerful," Nolan laughed nervously. Adrian didn't join in. Hazel was watching Vincent with an expression I couldn't interpret. "Why are you telling us this?" she asked. Vincent's smile was gentle, almost sad. "Because in places this remote, this old, it pays to remember that we're not the apex predators we think we are. The wilderness has its own rules, and we're just visitors here." Later, as I lay in my tent listening to the absolute silence outside, I thought about those words. Through the tent fabric, I could see the glow of the fire dying down. Grayson had volunteered for first watch, his large silhouette moving periodically as he fed more wood to the flames. I must have dozed off, because I woke to a sound that shouldn't exist, a high-pitched keening that came from somewhere down the mountain, rising and falling like a siren, but organic, alive. It set every nerve ending in my body screaming with primal fear. The sound cut off abruptly, and in the silence that followed, I heard Grayson's voice, low and tight with terror. Julian, you need to see this." I crawled out of my tent to find everyone else emerging too, drawn by that awful sound. Grayson stood at the edge of the overlook, his flashlight pointed down into the darkness below. "I saw something," he said. "It was climbing, coming up toward us." We stood together at the edge, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. At first, there was nothing. Then Adrian's light caught something moving between the trees about 100 yards below us, and my blood turned to ice. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs too long and thin to be human. Its skin looked gray in the flashlight beams, stretched tight over bones that jutted at wrong angles. But it was the way it moved that truly horrified me. Scuttling up the mountainside with a spider-like gait, its head swiveling back and forth as if scenting the air. And it was climbing toward us. The morning came with a fog so thick I could barely see 10 feet in any direction. We'd spent the rest of the night huddled together around the fire, taking turns keeping watch, our backs to the flames as we stared out into the darkness. Whatever we'd seen, it hadn't come closer, but neither had it left. Several times throughout the night, we'd heard movement in the trees below the overlook, accompanied by sounds that my mind still refused to properly process. Something between clicking and whispering, with an underlying tone that made my teeth ache. Vincent had been oddly calm through it all, which should have been reassuring but somehow made everything worse. While the rest of us jumped at every sound, he sat with his back against a rock, eyes closed, almost meditative. "We need to leave," Evelyn said for the 10th time as weak sunlight began filtering through the fog. Her face was drawn, eyes red from lack of sleep. "We go back down the way we came, right now." "Adrian can barely walk on that ankle," Grayson reminded her gently. "And going back means going through those dead trees we saw. Whatever that thing was, it came from that direction." "So what do you suggest?" Nolan demanded, his usual competitive bravado stripped away by a night of fear. "We just stay here and wait for it to come back?" I pulled out my map, studying the contour lines by flashlight. "There's another trail," I said. "It branches off about a quarter-mile back the way we came, heads northeast, eventually connects with a Forest Service road. It's longer, but it keeps us on high ground and away from that dead zone." Hazel leaned over my shoulder, tracing the route with her finger. "That's the old Merchant's Trail," she said. "It's mostly abandoned now, but yeah, it could work." She paused, biting her lip. "There are stories about that trail, though. Old stories." "Worse than what we saw last night?" Claire asked, clutching her camera like a talisman. She'd been snapping pictures compulsively since dawn, as if documenting everything might somehow make it less real. Hazel didn't answer, which was answer enough. We broke camp quickly, our movements jittery with exhaustion and fear. The fog had lifted slightly by the time we started back down the trail, though visibility was still poor. Adrian limped along, supported by Grayson and me, his face twisted in pain with every step. We moved in a tight group, nobody wanting to be at the front or rear of our line. We'd gone maybe half a mile when Claire screamed. We all spun around to find her standing frozen, pointing at something just off the trail. Hanging from a low branch was what looked at first like a bundle of sticks, but as my eyes adjusted, I realized it was something much worse. Bones, small bones, arranged in a deliberate pattern, lashed together with what might have been dried sinew or vines. "What the hell is that?" Nolan whispered. Vincent stepped forward, examining the grotesque mobile without touching it. "A warning," he said simply, "or a marker. These mountains have their own language." "You're talking like these things are real," Adrian said, his voice rising with hysteria. "Like that thing last night was actually some kind of monster and not just a bear or—" "You know it wasn't a bear," Vincent interrupted, his tone patient but firm. "We all know what we saw. The question is what we do about it." I didn't like the way he said that, as if this was all somehow expected. "What do you mean, what we do about it?" "We get the hell out of here. That's what we do." Vincent met my eyes, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker in his expression. Guilt? Resignation? It was gone before I could name it. "Of course," he said. "Let's keep moving." We found the junction with the Merchant's Trail 10 minutes later. The branch off was barely visible, overgrown with brambles and clearly unused for years. As we pushed through the vegetation onto the narrow path, the temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. The trees here grew differently, twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like arthritic fingers. "I don't like this," Evelyn whispered. But we were committed now. The main trail behind us led back past the dead zone, and none of us wanted to go that way. The Merchant's Trail wound along the ridgeline, sometimes climbing, sometimes dipping into steep ravines before climbing again. The fog came and went in patches, one moment giving us clear views of the mountains around us, the next reducing our world to a claustrophobic gray bubble. We walked in silence, conserving our energy and our courage. It was Hazel who first noticed someone was missing. We'd stopped for a water break in a small clearing, and she did a quick head count, her face going pale. "Where's Vincent?" We looked around in confusion. I could have sworn he'd been right behind me just moments before, but the trail behind us was empty. We called his name, our voices echoing strangely in the fog, but got no response. "He probably just stopped to piss," Nolan said, but he didn't sound convinced. "He'll catch up." We waited 15 minutes, then 20. Vincent never appeared. Grayson wanted to go back and search for him, but I convinced him it was too dangerous to split up further. We left clear markers and continued on, telling ourselves Vincent knew these mountains and could take care of himself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't just wandered off. Something had taken him, silently and completely, and we hadn't noticed until it was too late. The trail grew worse as the day wore on. Several times we had to help Adrian across fallen logs or up steep inclines, his injured ankle slowing us to a crawl. The sun was already past its zenith when we heard the sound again, that terrible keening, closer this time, coming from multiple directions at once. "Run," Grayson said, his voice tight. "We have to run." But we couldn't, not with Adrian, barely able to walk. We moved as fast as we could, practically carrying him, while those horrible sounds echoed through the forest around us. I caught glimpses of movement in the fog, shapes that were there and gone, always just at the edge of perception. We stumbled into another clearing, this one dominated by a massive oak tree that looked ancient beyond measure. Its trunk was easily 15 feet across, and its branches spread out like a cathedral ceiling. But it was what hung from those branches that made us stop in our tracks. Dozens of those bone arrangements, clicking and rattling in a wind we couldn't feel, creating a sound like wind chimes made in hell. "We're in its territory," Hazel breathed. "This is its place." "It's?" Claire's voice was barely audible. "What is it? What are we dealing with?" Before anyone could answer, Adrian screamed. Something had grabbed his leg from the underbrush at the edge of the clearing, something with fingers too long and joints that bent the wrong way. Grayson lunged forward, grabbing Adrian's arms, and a horrible tug of war began. I saw it then, really saw it for the first time in the pale afternoon light filtering through the fog. The creature's face emerged from the bushes, and I understood why people went mad from seeing things they couldn't explain. Its features were almost human, but stretched and distorted like a reflection in a funhouse mirror. Its mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing too many teeth, all of them sharp. But worst of all were its eyes, intelligent, aware, and filled with an endless, aching hunger. Nolan and I jumped forward, grabbing Adrian as well, pulling against the creature's grip. For a moment, the three of us struggled against whatever held Adrian, and I could feel its terrible strength, its absolute determination. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, Adrian's pants ripped, and we all tumbled backward. The creature released him and melted back into the fog, but we'd all seen it now. We knew what stalked us. "Wendigo," Hazel whispered, the word falling into the clearing like a stone into still water. The old stories called it Wendigo. We ran then, all pretense of careful hiking abandoned. Adrian somehow found the strength to stumble along with us, driven by pure terror. The trail twisted and turned, and behind us, we could hear pursuit, breaking branches, that awful keening, and underneath it all, a sound like laughter, if laughter could be hungry. When we finally stopped, gasping for air, we'd lost someone else. Claire was gone, her camera lying abandoned on the trail behind us, its lens cracked and useless. Evelyn was sobbing, Grayson holding her tight. Nolan had his hands on his knees, trying not to throw up. Adrian sat on a rock, staring at his torn pants and the scratches on his leg that were already beginning to look infected, the flesh around them turning an unhealthy gray. And I realized with terrible certainty that we weren't going to make it out of these mountains. Not all of us. Maybe not any of us. Night was falling fast, and we had no choice but to make camp. We'd found a rocky outcropping with our backs to a cliff face, giving us at least one direction we didn't have to defend. Adrian's condition had worsened throughout the afternoon. The scratches on his leg had spread, gray veins creeping up from the wounds, and he'd developed a fever that left him shivering despite the extra layers we'd wrapped around him. "We need to talk about what's happening," I said quietly to Grayson and Hazel, while the others tried to get a fire started with shaking hands. "Adrian's getting worse, and it's not infection. Not normal infection anyway." Hazel nodded grimly. "The stories say the Wendigo's touch spreads its hunger. Once you're marked, you become like it, always starving, no matter how much you eat. Eventually, you start craving what it craves." She couldn't bring herself to say the last word, but we all knew what she meant. "How do we stop it?" Grayson asked. "The old ways say fire and silver, but—" Hazel gestured helplessly at our meager campfire. "I don't think that's enough. This thing, it's not just a creature. It's a force, a manifestation of something wrong in the world." I thought about Vincent's stories from that first night, his knowing looks, the way he'd seemed to be leading us somewhere specific. "Vincent knew," I said. He knew what was up here. That's why he suggested this trail. But why? Grayson demanded. Why would he bring us here? We didn't have an answer, and the question died as Adrian suddenly sat up, his eyes wild. I'm so hungry, he whispered. God, I'm so hungry. His gaze fixed on Evelyn, and for just a moment, I saw something inhuman flicker in his expression. Nolan moved between them instinctively. Adrian, buddy, we've got food. Let me get you something to eat. But Adrian shook his head violently. It won't help. It won't help. I can feel it inside me, changing me. I can feel what it wants. His voice broke. You need to leave me here. Get away from me before I become like it. We're not leaving anyone, I said firmly, though I had no idea how we'd keep that promise. We stick together. We make it through the night, and at first light, we push for the Forest Service Road. It can't be more than a few miles now. It was a lie. I had no idea how far we were from anywhere safe, but we all needed something to hold on to. We took turns keeping watch through the night, 2 people awake at all times. The forest around us was alive with sounds now, no longer silent but filled with whispers and movements. Several times, we saw shapes circling our camp just beyond the firelight, and once, we heard Vincent's voice calling from the darkness. Help me, please, help me. But we all knew it wasn't really Vincent. Not anymore. Adrian's condition continued to deteriorate. The gray veins had spread across his entire leg and were creeping up his torso. His fever spiked, and he began muttering in a language none of us recognized, guttural and ancient. As midnight approached, Evelyn suddenly stood up, her eyes unfocused. I hear it, she whispered. It's calling me. Grayson grabbed her arm. Evelyn, no, stay here, stay with me. But she pulled away from him with surprising strength, walking toward the edge of our firelight. It's beautiful, she said dreamily. Don't you see? We've been going about survival all wrong, fighting against the hunger instead of embracing it. If we just let go, we wouldn't have to be afraid anymore. Evelyn! Grayson lunged forward, but she was already running into the darkness. He started after her, but Hazel and I held him back. It's too late, Hazel said, tears streaming down her face. She's been marked too. We didn't see it happen, but she's been marked. Grayson's anguished cry echoed through the mountains, and from the darkness, we heard an answering sound. Evelyn's laughter, wrong and twisted, joined by other voices in a horrible chorus. They're playing with us, Nolan said, his voice hollow. They could have killed us any time, but they're playing with us. I realized he was right. This wasn't just about hunting or feeding. The Wendigo, or Wendigos plural if there were more than one, were enjoying our terror. They were drawing it out, savoring our despair the way a gourmand savors a fine meal. Adrian suddenly stood up, and we all instinctively backed away. His skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and his eyes reflected the firelight with an unnatural gleam. I understand now, he said, his voice not quite his own. The hunger isn't a curse, it's a gift, an evolution. Why should we limit ourselves to what's morally acceptable when we're so much more than that? Adrian, I said carefully, you're not yourself. This thing is changing you, making you think things that aren't true. He smiled, and his teeth looked longer than they should. I've never been more myself. I've never been more honest, and I'm so hungry. He lunged at Nolan with inhuman speed. They went down in a tangle of limbs, Adrian's teeth snapping inches from Nolan's throat. Grayson tackled Adrian off his brother, and the two of them wrestled while Nolan scrambled backward. The fire, Hazel shouted. Get him to the fire. I grabbed a burning branch and thrust it at Adrian, who recoiled with an inhuman shriek. The flames seemed to cause him actual pain, and he retreated to the edge of our camp, crouching there like an animal, watching us with those terrible, hungry eyes. We can't stay here, I said. We move now, in the dark. It's our only chance. That's insane, Nolan protested. We'll be defenseless out there. We're defenseless here, I countered. At least moving gives us a chance. We gathered what we could carry and fled into the night, leaving Adrian crouched by our fire. Behind us, his voice joined the chorus calling from the darkness, and I tried not to think about Evelyn and Claire and Vincent, tried not to imagine what had become of them. The forest was a nightmare of shadows and whispers. We ran blindly, following what we hoped was the trail, our flashlights cutting useless tunnels through the darkness. Things moved parallel to us, keeping pace, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, herding us like sheep toward some unseen destination. We burst into a clearing, and our lights revealed a sight that stopped us cold. Standing in the center was a massive Wendigo, easily 12 feet tall, its emaciated body covered in tattered gray skin stretched tight over protruding bones. Its antlers, for it had antlers like some twisted mockery of a deer, spread 8 feet across, and surrounding it were the others, smaller ones, newer ones, including 3 that I recognized even in their transformed state. Vincent, Claire, Evelyn, they'd all become like it. "Welcome," the largest one said, and its voice was like wind through dead trees. "We've been waiting for you." "Why?" I managed to choke out. "Why us? Why any of this?" The Wendigo tilted its head. "Because the hunger must spread. Because we were once like you, fighting against our nature, pretending to be civilized, and because Vincent promised us fresh vessels. He was the first of our new crop, you see. He brought you here deliberately, offering you up to extend his own existence." Vincent's transformed face twisted in what might have been shame or might have been satisfaction. It was hard to tell anymore. "But I'm feeling generous," the Wendigo continued. "I'll give you a choice. Join us willingly, and the transformation will be painless. Or run, and we'll hunt you until you're too exhausted to resist, and then we'll change you anyway. Either way, you'll become what we are. It's already begun. You've breathed the air of our territory, drunk water from our streams. The seeds are planted." I looked at Grayson, at Nolan, at Hazel. I saw the same realization in their eyes that I felt in my heart. We weren't going to escape. We'd been doomed from the moment we'd entered these mountains. "There has to be another way," Grayson said, and I loved him for his stubborn refusal to give up hope. The Wendigo laughed. "Fire can kill us, but you have no fire. Silver can wound us, but you have no silver. You are in our world now, and in our world, we make the rules." That's when Hazel stepped forward, and I saw something in her hand I hadn't noticed before, a lighter and a small bottle of camping fuel. "You know what I just remembered?" she said, her voice eerily calm. "The old stories say the Wendigo can't cross running water, and about 50 yards that way," she pointed into the darkness, "there's a creek. I've been here before, years ago. I know these mountains." She flicked the lighter, and in its small flame I saw her smile, sad and resigned. "Run," she said. "I'll buy you time." "Hazel, no." I started toward her, but she'd already poured the fuel over herself and the surrounding vegetation. "The stories also say," she continued, "that we're never truly lost if we're willing to sacrifice ourselves for others. Maybe that's the one thing the hunger can't consume." She met my eyes. "Run, Julian. Tell people what happened here. Warn them about these mountains." The Wendigos had started forward, sensing her intention, but they were too slow. Hazel ignited herself in the clearing in a blast of heat and light that sent the creatures shrieking backward. "Run!" she screamed. We ran. Behind us, the forest caught fire, and the night filled with the sounds of the Wendigo's rage and pain. We crashed through the undergrowth, following the sound of water, and found the creek, maybe 20 feet across and running fast with snowmelt. We didn't hesitate. We plunged into the icy water and let the current take us, clinging to rocks and logs, barely keeping our heads above water. Behind us, at the creek's edge, we could see shapes gathering, pacing back and forth, unable or unwilling to cross. The creek carried us for what felt like hours, though it was probably less. Eventually, we pulled ourselves onto the far bank, shaking with cold and shock. In the distance, we could see the glow of the forest fire, and beyond that, the first gray light of dawn. "We need to keep moving," Nolan said through chattering teeth. "Get as far from here as possible." We stumbled through the pre-dawn darkness and finally found a hiking trail, a real one, with trail markers and signs. By full daylight, we reached a parking area where a ranger truck was just pulling in. The ranger took one look at us, soaking wet, wild-eyed, and near collapse, and called for help. Within an hour, we were being treated for hypothermia and dehydration at a small mountain clinic. The authorities asked questions, and we tried to answer. But how do you explain the truth? That ancient evil still lives in those mountains, waiting for the next group of naive hikers who think they can conquer the wilderness. They searched for the others, of course. Search parties combed the mountains for weeks. They found the remains of our camps, the burned section of forest where Hazel had made her last stand. But of Vincent, Claire, Evelyn, Adrian, and Hazel herself, they found nothing. The official report listed them as lost in a tragic hiking accident, possibly caught in the forest fire. But Grayson, Nolan, and I know the truth. On cold nights, when the wind blows from the mountains, we can still hear them calling, those voices that sound almost human, inviting us to come back, to join them, to embrace the hunger. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I feel the pull, the seeds that were planted in those mountains, the changes that began before we escaped, I catch myself staring at strangers and thinking thoughts I shouldn't think, feeling hunger that goes beyond normal appetite. I fight it every day. We all do. But I wonder how long before the fight becomes too much, before the call of the mountains grows too strong to resist. The Wendigo was right about one thing. Once you've entered their world, you never truly leave. The hunger follows you, patient and eternal, waiting for the moment you let your guard down. And in the deep places of the Appalachian Mountains, where the maps are vague and the trails are forgotten, they're still out there, still waiting, still hungry, always hungry. I never should have come back to these mountains. The Appalachians had always called to me with their ancient, twisted beauty, but this time felt different. This time, the forest seemed to watch with eyes I couldn't see, and the silence between the wind's howls felt pregnant with terrible secrets. I'd returned to catalog the old trails near Harlan Hollow, a task that seemed simple enough when Hudson first proposed it back in September. Now, standing at the trailhead with frost crisping the dead leaves beneath my boots, I wondered if I'd made a fatal mistake. Hudson was late. We'd agreed to meet at dawn, but the sun had already burned away the morning mist, leaving the November air sharp and bitter. I checked my phone for the third time, knowing full well there was no signal this deep in the backcountry. The parking area held only my truck and one other vehicle, a rusted Ford that looked like it had been abandoned for weeks, its windows fogged with condensation and a fine layer of yellow pollen coating its hood despite the season. I was about to head back down the mountain when I heard it, a sound that froze the blood in my veins. It wasn't quite a scream, but it wasn't animal either. The noise seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the valley like the cry of something that had forgotten what it meant to be alive. The trees absorbed it, swallowed it, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. Then I heard my name. Help me. The voice was Hudson's, but wrong somehow stretched thin like taffy, hollowed out. It came from deep within the forest, up the trail that wound between ancient hemlocks and disappeared into shadow. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get in my truck and drive until I hit civilization. But Hudson was my friend. We'd explored these mountains together for years, ever since we were kids sneaking away from our family's cabins to chase adventure. I couldn't leave him. I grabbed my pack and headlamp, even though it was still daylight, and started up the trail. The path was familiar, one I'd hiked dozens of times, but today it felt alien. The trees leaned in at wrong angles. The undergrowth rustled with movements I couldn't quite catch. And that smell, God, that smell. It was like rot and winter and starvation all mixed together, a stench that seemed to seep from the earth itself. Hudson, I called out, my voice embarrassingly small in the vast silence. Where are you? The trail steepened as it climbed toward the ridge. My breath came in white puffs, and my legs burned with the effort. I'd been hiking for maybe 20 minutes when I found the first sign that something was terribly wrong. Hudson's backpack, torn open and scattered across the trail. His water bottle lay crushed, the metal dented as if something with incredible strength had squeezed it like a tin can. His compass was there too, the glass face shattered, the needle spinning uselessly, but no blood. That should have comforted me, but somehow it made everything worse. I picked up his pack, noting the deep gouges in the fabric, 4 parallel tears that looked almost like claw marks, except they were too long, too deliberate. Whatever made these marks had fingers. Hudson, I shouted, louder now, fear giving my voice an edge. This isn't funny. Where are you? The forest offered no response except the wind moving through bare branches, a sound like labored breathing. I pressed on, following a series of disturbed areas, broken branches, disturbed leaves, strange marks in the soft earth that might have been footprints. They were human-sized but elongated, as if something had walked on tiptoe with too many joints in its legs. Every rational part of my brain told me to turn back, but Hudson's voice kept calling from somewhere ahead, always just out of reach, always begging for help. The sun was lower now, painting the forest in shades of amber and shadow. I checked my watch. 3 hours had passed, though it felt like minutes. Time moved strangely here, pooling in the hollows and dripping away like sap from wounded bark. That's when I saw the cabin. It squatted between 2 massive oaks, a structure so old and weathered it seemed to have grown from the mountain itself. The roof sagged dangerously, and the single window was dark as a dead eye, but smoke rose from the chimney, thin, gray, steady. Someone was home. I approached cautiously, every horror story my grandmother had told me flickering through my mind. She'd grown up in these mountains, had warned me about places like this, about the things that lived in the deep woods. There are hungers older than man, she'd whispered during thunderstorms, her gnarled hands gripping mine. Hunger's that winter never satisfies. The cabin door hung open, creaking on rusted hinges. "Hello?" I called from the porch, not quite brave enough to step inside. "Is anyone there? I'm looking for my friend." The smell hit me then, the same rotting winter starvation stench from the trail, but stronger now, concentrated. It poured from the cabin's interior like invisible smoke, making my eyes water and my stomach heave. I should have run. I should have turned around and never looked back, but I saw something in the darkness beyond the door, a figure, tall and impossibly thin, standing in the shadows with its back to me. "Hudson," I whispered. The figure turned, and I saw its face. It wasn't Hudson. It couldn't have been human at all, though it wore human shape like an ill-fitting coat. The thing's skin was gray-white, stretched tight over prominent bones, and its eyes, God, its eyes were yellow and ancient and filled with an endless, gnawing hunger. Its mouth hung open, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too numerous, stained with something dark. But worst of all was its smell, its presence, the way it seemed to radiate cold and desperation and a ravenous need that had burned away everything else until only appetite remained. The Wendigo, my grandmother's stories flooded back, tales of cursed souls who'd turned to cannibalism during harsh winters, who'd been transformed by their terrible hunger into something neither living nor dead. Spirits doomed to wander the mountains forever, searching for human flesh, always starving, never satisfied. The creature took a step toward me, its joints cracking like breaking ice. It moved wrong, all angles and jerking motions, as if it had forgotten how human limbs were supposed to work. "Help, me." It spoke with Hudson's voice, perfectly mimicked, and I realized with horror that it had been luring me here all along, calling me deeper into the forest with my friend's stolen words. I ran. Branches whipped my face as I crashed down the trail, my lungs burning, my legs pumping with pure terror-fueled adrenaline. Behind me, I heard it following, not running, but moving fast anyway, its footsteps thundering against the earth, accompanied by that awful breathing, that hungry wheezing. The trail seemed different now, longer, twisting in ways I didn't remember. Twilight had fallen completely, and my headlamp beam danced wildly as I fled, illuminating snapshots of horror. Trees with symbols carved into their bark, bones scattered among the leaves, and once, just for a moment, another figure standing motionless between the trees, watching me with those same yellow eyes. There was more than one. My truck appeared ahead, a miracle of normalcy in this nightmare forest. I fumbled for my keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely grip them. The Wendigo emerged from the tree line as I wrenched open the door, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the dying light. It didn't rush forward. It simply stood there, watching, waiting, as if it knew I could never truly escape. The engine roared to life, and I threw the truck into reverse, tires spinning on the loose gravel. As I pulled away, my headlights swept across the parking area one final time, illuminating that rusted Ford I'd seen earlier. Hudson's truck. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Hudson had been here. He'd parked his truck and hiked up that trail, just like I had. And whatever happened to him up there, in that cabin, or in those woods, had transformed him into something else, something hungry and hollow and wrong. Or maybe, and this thought was somehow worse, maybe Hudson had never made it to the parking lot at all. Maybe the Wendigo had been using his voice, his identity, to lure people into the forest for longer than I wanted to imagine. I drove without stopping, didn't slow down until the mountains were dark shapes in my rearview mirror. My phone buzzed as I hit the first cell tower, messages flooding in. 3 were from Hudson's sister, Emily, each more frantic than the last. "Have you seen Hudson? He never came home. Mom's calling the authorities. Please, if you know anything." I pulled over at a gas station in town, my hands still trembling, and stared at the messages. What could I tell her? That her brother was gone, transformed, or perhaps had never been there at all. That something wearing his voice had tried to lead me to the same fate. In the end, I called the local ranger station and reported what I'd found: Hudson's abandoned truck, his destroyed backpack, the strange cabin. I left out the creature, knowing how it would sound. They promised to send a search team at first light, but I knew what they wouldn't find. The mountains kept their secrets, and the Wendigo kept its prey. Hudson was gone, claimed by an ancient hunger that could never be satisfied. And somewhere up in those hollows, in the deep places where winter never fully releases its grip, something waited for the next hiker, the next voice to mimic, the next meal to pursue through the endless, starving darkness. I never went back to the Appalachians. Some trails, once walked, change you forever, and some hungers, once witnessed, never let you forget that you, too, are made of meat and warmth, exactly what the winter craves most. The mountains still call sometimes, late at night when the wind howls, but now I hear other voices in that call, familiar voices twisted into something hungry and hollow. Hudson's voice, asking for help, begging me to come back. I never answer.